The year was 1927, and beneath the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a British archaeologist named Edmund Carrington had just made a discovery that would vanish from history within 48 hours. The basement storage rooms were supposed to contain nothing more than duplicate artifacts and empty crates. But Carrington's torch beam caught something the museum's official maps didn't acknowledge: a sealed doorway behind a false wall of limestone blocks, hidden in a forgotten corridor where dust lay thick enough to muffle footsteps. When he finally pried open that ancient seal, the air that escaped was cold, impossibly cold for a chamber buried in Egyptian sand. The room beyond measured roughly 20 feet across, its walls lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves that somehow, miraculously, had survived the weight of centuries. And on those shelves sat hundreds of papyrus scrolls, their preservation so perfect they might have been placed there yesterday. But it was the hieroglyphs covering those texts that made Carrington's hands shake as he reached for his camera. The script was Egyptian, unmistakably so, yet arranged in patterns he'd never encountered in 15 years of studying ancient languages. The symbols seemed familiar individually, but combined in ways that felt wrong, as if the grammar itself came from some earlier evolution of the language, something that predated even the Old Kingdom. Carrington spent the next 6 hours in that chamber, photographing everything, his excitement building with each image captured. The texts described astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and historical records that extended Egyptian civilization back not 3,000 years, but tens of thousands. He documented walls covered in star charts showing constellations in positions they hadn't occupied in recorded history. He found king lists that named dynasties before Narmer, before Menes, before anyone the academic world recognized as Egypt's first rulers. And strangest of all, he discovered repeated references to the time before the waters rose and the knowledge carried from the older world, phrases that suggested Egypt wasn't the beginning of something, but the continuation of something far more ancient. The smell in that chamber was peculiar, not decay, but something almost medicinal, as if the papyri had been treated with preservatives whose formula had been lost to time. The temperature remained constant, cool and dry, conditions that should have been impossible in a sealed room beneath Cairo's humidity. Carrington noted everything, his archaeological training demanding precision, even as his mind raced with implications that could rewrite every textbook on ancient civilization. By sunrise, he'd filled 3 notebooks with observations and shot 2 entire rolls of film. He locked the chamber, pocketed the key, and went directly to the museum director to report what he'd found. That conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. Within the hour, officials from the Egyptian Antiquities Service arrived, not with congratulations, but with stern faces and quiet words about protocol violations and unauthorized access. They confiscated his notebooks, his camera, every scrap of documentation he'd created in that hidden room. The chamber was resealed the next day, this time with modern concrete. Carrington received a telegram 48 hours later, recalling him to England for what the message termed urgent departmental matters. He never returned to Egypt. His name appeared in one final archaeological journal publication 6 months later, then vanished from academic records entirely, as if his career had simply evaporated. The photographs he took that night were never developed, or if they were, they never saw public light. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened beneath Cairo's streets and ancient stones. The disappearance of Carrington's discovery would have been easier to dismiss as an isolated incident if it stood alone. But when you trace the fingerprints of suppression through the archives of Egyptology, a pattern emerges that's too consistent to be coincidence, too deliberate to be bureaucratic accident. The threads reach back through decades, connecting incidents that were never meant to be connected, revealing a systematic effort to contain knowledge that threatened something fundamental about our accepted timeline of human civilization. In 1854, a French expedition working near Luxor uncovered a cache of papyri sealed in clay jars beneath what they believed was a minor administrative building. The initial reports, published in obscure European journals before the suppression took hold, described texts that placed Egyptian culture in a highly developed state during periods that biblical chronology insisted the world itself was only a few thousand years old. The papyri detailed pre-dynastic Egypt, not as primitive villages, but as organized cities with complex social structures, advanced agriculture, and sophisticated religious practices. Within 10 years, those documents had disappeared from the Museum of Antiquities in Cairo, removed from inventory records as if they'd never existed. Requests by later scholars to examine them were met with blank stares and claims that no such acquisition had ever occurred. The pattern continued into the next century. During excavations near Abydos in 1892, British archaeologists photographed temple inscriptions that described astronomical cycles spanning 40,000 years, calculations that tracked planetary movements with precision that shouldn't have been possible without advanced instruments. The lead archaeologist, a man named Wilson who'd previously published extensively, submitted these photographs to the Royal Geographic Society, along with detailed measurements and translations. The Society acknowledged receipt, promised publication within 6 months, then went silent. Wilson's subsequent letters went unanswered. The photographs were seized by Egyptian authorities during a surprise inspection of the excavation site, declared national treasures too sensitive for foreign reproduction, and transferred to storage facilities, where they remained inaccessible to researchers, even Egyptian ones. Then came 1933, and perhaps the most dramatic suppression of all. A team excavating beneath the Temple of Hathor at Dendera discovered what they described in private letters as an intact library, wooden shelves still standing, hundreds of scrolls organized by subject matter in a preservation state that defied explanation. The texts covered medicine, engineering, mathematics, and astronomical observation, with a level of sophistication that shocked even the most experienced archaeologists on site. Within weeks, the Egyptian Department of Antiquities ordered the entire find transferred to an undisclosed location for proper cataloguing and preservation. No catalogue was ever published. No scholar outside a select circle was ever granted access. When researchers inquired years later, officials claimed the library had deteriorated upon exposure to air, a convenient explanation that conveniently eliminated any need to produce the actual texts. These weren't rogue incidents or careless record-keeping. Each suppression involved immediate governmental response, confiscation of documentation, and the systematic removal of evidence from public access. The same institutions appeared repeatedly: the Egyptian Antiquities Service, certain departments within the British Museum, specific academic circles that seemed to function as gatekeepers rather than researchers. And always, the texts that disappeared shared common themes, timelines that extended far beyond accepted chronology, technological knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced, and descriptions of Egypt as the inheritor of even older wisdom rather than the originator of civilization itself. What if those texts weren't destroyed at all? What if they were simply moved, archived in basement rooms and private collections, accessible only to researchers willing to sign agreements that guaranteed their silence? What if the knowledge sits there still, waiting in locked facilities where only certain eyes have ever read what those ancient scribes actually recorded? The question isn't whether these texts existed. The documentation proves they did. The question is what they contained that made their suppression worth maintaining across generations, across institutional changes, across entire shifts in academic understanding. The fragments that escaped suppression, leaked through academic whispers and testimonies from former museum workers who finally spoke near the end of their careers, paint a picture of knowledge so fundamentally challenging that its revelation would require rewriting not just Egyptian history, but the entire story of human civilization's development. These weren't minor adjustments to timelines or disputes over dynasty sequences. The suppressed texts described a reality so different from accepted narratives that academic institutions apparently decided the truth was more dangerous than the lie. The first category of forbidden knowledge centered on chronology that stretched Egyptian civilization back to periods. Mainstream archaeology insists humans were still living in primitive conditions. Multiple sources, corroborated through separate leaks, decades apart, reference texts that place highly organized Egyptian society as far back as 36,000 years before the Common Era. These weren't vague mythological references to primordial time, but specific king lists with names, reign lengths, and detailed descriptions of administrative structures, architectural achievements, and social organization. The texts repeatedly mentioned the time before the waters rose, describing a period of great advancement followed by catastrophic flooding that forced the survivors to rebuild on higher ground, carrying their knowledge forward into what we now recognize as dynastic Egypt. The second category involved technological and scientific sophistication that shouldn't exist in any ancient civilization, let alone one we've dated to 3,000 years ago. Leaked academic papers, published briefly in obscure journals before being retracted, described mathematical texts that calculated planetary movements across cycles of thousands of years, requiring observational data accumulated over periods far longer than Egyptian civilization was supposed to exist. Medical papyri detailed surgical procedures involving techniques that weren't rediscovered until the 20th century, descriptions of cataract surgery, bone-setting methods that matched modern orthopedic principles, and pharmaceutical preparations whose chemical compositions suggested knowledge of molecular properties. Engineering documents outlined principles for moving massive stone blocks using leverage systems and counterweights that, while theoretically possible, required mathematical understanding and material science that seemed impossibly advanced for the Bronze Age. The third category remained the most controversial and the most heavily suppressed cosmological texts that described the Egyptian people's origins in ways that didn't fit comfortable narratives about human migration and cultural development. These passages, ambiguous in their language, repeatedly referenced knowledge carried from elsewhere, cities that existed before this land, and wisdom preserved from the older world. Some interpretations suggested these were simply poetic references to the pre-dynastic period or mythological prehistory. But other readings, the ones that made institutional authorities most uncomfortable, implied something more literal descriptions that could be interpreted as actual migration from some lost civilization, possibly one destroyed by the very cataclysm the texts repeatedly mentioned, possibly one located in regions now beneath ocean waters whose levels have risen dramatically since the last ice age. Specific examples appeared in the leaked materials that made the suppression suddenly comprehensible. Texts describing the Great Pyramid not as a tomb but as something called the structure of equilibrium, built for purposes the fragmentary translations couldn't quite capture, but that involved astronomical alignment and energy manipulation. Papyri detailing observations of celestial events that would require instruments capable of magnification and precise angle measurement. Temple inscriptions describing ages of human civilization, rising to great heights, falling to near extinction, then rising again in endless cycles, with Egypt representing the latest iteration of this pattern rather than its beginning. These weren't fringe theories or misinterpreted symbols. Former researchers who'd examined the actual texts in restricted archives described them as methodical, detailed, and consistent across multiple sources separated by centuries. The knowledge they contained wasn't fantastical but concrete, specific, and deeply troubling to a historical narrative that insisted human civilization progressed in a simple, linear fashion from primitive to advanced. But why would anyone want to suppress this information? To understand why Egyptian texts were suppressed, you have to understand the world that was excavating them, a world where ancient artifacts weren't just historical curiosities, but weapons in ideological wars that shaped empires and threatened the foundations of entire belief systems. The decades between 1860 and 1900, when Egyptology was transforming from adventurous treasure hunting into formal academic discipline, were also decades when European colonial powers needed very specific narratives about civilization, progress, and racial hierarchy to justify their presence across the globe. The problem appeared almost immediately in the excavations. Biblical chronology, which most European institutions still treated as literal historical truth, placed the creation of the world around 4,000 years before Christ. Archbishop Usher's widely accepted calculation gave a precise date, October 23, 4004 BCE, at 9 in the morning. But Egyptian artifacts, even by conservative dating methods, showed sophisticated civilization existing well before that theoretical creation date. Temple inscriptions referenced kings and dynasties that would push organized Egyptian society back to 6,000, 8,000, even 10,000 years before the present timelines that didn't just challenge biblical interpretation, but shattered it completely. Religious institutions held extraordinary power over academic funding in 19th century Europe. Museum boards included bishops and clergy, who saw their role as protecting Christian truth from archaeological heresy. When French archaeologist Auguste Mariette discovered inscriptions at Abydos suggesting pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization of remarkable sophistication, his preliminary reports generated excitement among scholars, but alarm among institutional sponsors. His later publications, carefully edited, reframed these findings to fit comfortable timelines, dating contentious inscriptions later than his field notes suggested. interpreting clear historical references as mythological poetry. Letters between Mariette and his sponsors, now archived in Parisian libraries, show the pressure explicitly continue the work, bring glory to France, but ensure the findings support rather than undermine Christian chronology. Colonial ideology added another layer of necessary narrative control. The entire justification for European presence in Africa and Asia rested on claims that these regions represented earlier stages of human development, primitive peoples who needed European guidance to reach civilization's heights. But Egypt presented an uncomfortable contradiction. African people creating architectural marvels, developing sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, establishing complex governmental systems, all while Europeans were supposedly living in tribal simplicity. The solution wasn't to deny Egyptian achievement entirely, which the physical evidence made impossible, but to separate Egypt from Africa conceptually, to position it as an anomaly, influenced perhaps by mysterious outside forces rather than representing indigenous African genius. Gaston Maspero, who directed the Egyptian Antiquities Service for decades, found himself trapped between scientific integrity and institutional survival. His excavations repeatedly uncovered evidence suggesting Egyptian civilization was far older and more advanced than official timelines allowed. His private correspondence reveals frustration discoveries that should have revolutionized human history were instead reinterpreted, redated, or simply left unpublished. Papyri describing astronomical observations spanning thousands of years were catalogued but not translated. Temple inscriptions referencing pre-dynastic knowledge systems were photographed but explained away as religious mythology rather than historical record. The irony emerged after Egyptian independence in the early 20th century, when control of antiquities shifted from European to Egyptian hands. The new Egyptian authorities had their own reasons to maintain careful narrative control. Post-colonial nationalism wanted to emphasize pharaonic glory, to reclaim ancient Egypt as proof of Arab and African greatness. But introducing elements that seemed too fantastical, civilizations tens of thousands of years old, technological knowledge that appeared impossibly advanced, origins, stories that didn't fit, comfortable frameworks risked undermining credibility. Islamic historical frameworks also influenced what could be officially embraced. Texts describing pre-Islamic religious practices in too much detail or suggesting knowledge systems that might compete with Islamic teaching faced quiet suppression from the new Egyptian Department of Antiquities. The people who discovered the texts, who translated them, who understood their implications, weren't always the people who decided what they meant or whether anyone would hear about them. Career archaeologists learned quickly which discoveries would advance their professional standing and which would end their access to funding and excavation permits. The system didn't require conspiracy or coordinated suppression, it simply rewarded compliance and punished deviation, creating a self-perpetuating filter that allowed certain knowledge through while blocking anything too disruptive to establish narratives. But institutional pressure, however powerful, couldn't account for the systematic erasure that followed certain discoveries. Something more active was happening, methods more deliberate than simple academic gatekeeping. The suppression of Egyptian texts didn't always involve dramatic confiscations or destroyed evidence. Often, the erasure was methodical, bureaucratic, almost boring in its execution, which made it far more effective than any conspiracy of silence could ever be. The texts disappeared through administrative processes so mundane that decades later, researchers couldn't even determine when or why certain artifacts had become inaccessible. They simply vanished into systems designed to preserve knowledge, but which functioned, intentionally or not, to bury it. Physical removal formed the first and most straightforward method. Papyri and inscriptions that challenged accepted narratives would be transferred from display galleries to storage vaults, relabeled with nothing but inventory numbers that conveyed no information about content. Museum catalogues, which should have made every artifact accessible to researchers, somehow omitted these particular items or listed them under vague categories that discouraged investigation. Access required special permission, applications that went through committees which met irregularly and rejected most requests without explanation. Texts entered these systems and effectively ceased to exist for scholarly purposes, neither destroyed nor available, trapped in bureaucratic limbo that could last generations. Selective translation created a subtler form of erasure. Egyptian hieroglyphs required interpretation. The same symbols could mean different things depending on context, and passages could be rendered various ways while remaining technically accurate. Temple inscriptions at Edfu, photographed extensively in the 1930s, showed clear, undamaged text describing ancient chronologies and knowledge systems. Yet official translations marked crucial sections as deteriorated beyond interpretation, or meaning uncertain, despite the photographs showing crisp, readable hieroglyphs. Alternative translations, proposed by researchers who examined the same photographs, were rejected as unscholarly speculation, without serious engagement with their linguistic arguments. The texts remained technically published, but their most controversial content had been neutralized through claims of uncertainty that the physical evidence didn't support. Academic gatekeeping functioned as perhaps the most effective suppression mechanism. Peer review systems, designed to maintain scholarly standards, evolved into filters that rejected papers proposing extended Egyptian chronologies regardless of supporting evidence. The logic became circular. The consensus held that Egyptian civilization began around 3100 BCE. Therefore, any evidence suggesting earlier dates must be misinterpreted. Therefore, papers proposing earlier dates were rejected for contradicting established consensus. Tenure committees discouraged junior faculty from pursuing research into anomalous texts, not through explicit prohibition, but through quiet warnings about career viability. Grant funding flowed toward projects confirming accepted narratives, while researchers proposing alternative chronologies found their applications rejected as lacking scholarly foundation. Professional isolation served as punishment for those who persisted. Researchers who published about forbidden texts found themselves gradually excluded from academic circles, no longer invited to conferences, no longer cited by colleagues, their papers rejected by mainstream journals, forcing them towards smaller publications, which were then dismissed as fringe venues. Access to excavation sites depended on maintaining good relationships with antiquities authorities, relationships that cooled quickly for scholars who pushed controversial interpretations. The message was clear: pursue this research and sacrifice your career. Modern digital systems introduced new erasure methods. As museums scanned their collections for online databases, certain texts appeared with convenient technical problems, corrupted image files, mysteriously absent pages in multi-page documents, search metadata that made controversial items nearly impossible to find through normal queries. Digital versions of texts would omit passages that appeared in earlier published translations, the omissions explained as space considerations or focusing on representative samples. Physical access to verify discrepancies meant returning to the original problem of special permissions and bureaucratic barriers. Throughout these processes, most individuals weren't consciously suppressing truth. Curators followed established cataloging procedures. Translators applied standard interpretive frameworks. Peer reviewers enforced quality standards as they understood them. The system itself had evolved to maintain certain narratives, and individual actors simply operated within it, their small decisions accumulating into comprehensive suppression without requiring coordination or conscious conspiracy, which made it nearly impossible to challenge. There was no villain to confront, just institutional momentum that had calcified into immovable resistance to disruptive information. But some texts couldn't be completely erased. Despite all these methods, fragments survived, hidden sometimes in plain sight within the very museum collections that had tried to bury them. And what those fragments revealed made the suppression suddenly comprehensible. Not everything could be suppressed. Some texts were too public, too photographed, too widely discussed before the mechanisms of erasure could take hold. These survivors, scattered across museum collections and archaeological publications, offer glimpses of the knowledge that so many institutions work to contain. And what they reveal, even in fragmentary form, suggests an Egyptian civilization radically different from the one presented in textbooks, older, more knowledgeable, and connected to something that predated even its own magnificent dynasties. The Palermo Stone, along with its reconstructed companion fragments, contains king lists that should be impossible according to accepted chronology. Official Egyptology focuses on the stone's documentation of 1st through 5th dynasty rulers, using it to confirm the timeline everyone already accepts. But the earlier sections of the stone, the parts rarely discussed in mainstream scholarship, list rulers before Nama and Menes, before anyone recognized as Egypt's first pharaoh. These aren't vague mythological references but specific entries with regnal years, Nile flood heights, and administrative records. Some entries reference rulers reigning not for human lifespans, but for thousands of years, figures that orthodox archaeology dismisses as mythology, but which contain astronomical data that corresponds to actual celestial events, measurable across vast timescales. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on temple walls where they couldn't be removed without destroying the structure itself, describe the temple's construction according to plans from the time of the primeval gods. These texts detail architectural principles and mathematical formulas far more sophisticated than usually attributed to ancient Egypt geometric calculations for creating structures that amplify or channel specific energies, astronomical alignments precise to fractions of degrees, engineering knowledge that suggests understanding of principles modern physics wouldn't formalize until the 20th century. Orthodox interpretation treats these as religious mythology, symbolic descriptions of divine favor rather than literal technical documentation. But the mathematical precision embedded in the poetry suggests otherwise. References to the Book of Thoth appear throughout Egyptian literature, not the later Greek magical text that borrowed the name, but something older, an original Egyptian work describing astronomical and mathematical knowledge that would enable understanding of what the texts call all that the hidden stars affect upon the earth. Multiple papyri reference this book, describing its contents in fragments. Calculations spanning tens of thousands of years, observations requiring instruments of a sophistication we associate with much later civilizations, knowledge preserved from before the waters covered the old lands. The book itself has never been found, or if it has, it remains in restricted archives. But the references create a consistent picture of a comprehensive scientific text that unified astronomy, mathematics, and what we might now call physics into a single system. Medical papyri present perhaps the most concrete evidence of advanced knowledge. The Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus contain surgical procedures, anatomical knowledge, and pharmaceutical formulas that shouldn't exist in cultures supposedly limited to Bronze Age understanding. Descriptions of cataract surgery using instruments and techniques that match modern ophthalmological procedures. Bone-setting methods that demonstrate understanding of skeletal structure and healing processes not discovered until the Renaissance. Pharmaceutical preparations, whose chemical compositions, when analyzed, show sophisticated knowledge of how specific compounds interact with human physiology. Museum displays typically separate these advanced sections from the main exhibits, treating them as anomalies rather than evidence of systematic scientific knowledge. The pyramid texts themselves, carved into Old Kingdom tombs, describe the Zep Tepi the first time, a period of direct contact between humans and divine beings, when knowledge flowed freely and Egypt possessed understanding that later generations struggled to maintain. Orthodox interpretation reads this as pure mythology, symbolic religious poetry, but the texts include specific astronomical references, technological descriptions, and accounts of knowledge transmission that read less like myth and more like historical record written in religious language. The line between metaphor and literal description blurs in ways that make modern categorization difficult. Private collectors, operating outside institutional control, acquired texts that museums chose not to pursue or which were sold quietly to avoid scrutiny. Leaked photographs from these collections show papyri describing chronologies extending back 30,000 years, technological instructions for constructions whose purposes remain mysterious, and accounts of Egyptian origins that point towards something older, something that came before. What survives in fragments describes something that shouldn't be possible. According to our understanding of human development, an Egypt that measured time in tens of thousands of years and possessed knowledge we supposedly developed only centuries ago. But to understand why these fragments matter, we must understand the complete system of knowledge they're pieces of. The ceiling of the temple at Dendera holds a secret that most visitors never notice, walking beneath it without understanding what those ancient artists carved into stone. The zodiac there, famous enough to be photographed and studied, represents something far more sophisticated than a simple star map or agricultural calendar. The inscriptions describe stellar precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes which star sits at the celestial pole, a cycle taking 26,000 years to complete. The Greeks supposedly discovered this phenomenon around 150 BCE, when Hipparchus documented the shift. But the Dendera ceiling doesn't just acknowledge one cycle. It maps multiple complete cycles, showing stellar positions that would require continuous observation across more than 50,000 years. Mainstream Egyptology explains this as religious symbolism, mythological time, rather than actual astronomical record. But the mathematics embedded in those ceiling inscriptions tell a different story. The calculations are precise, measurable, corresponding to actual celestial mechanics that can be verified with modern astronomical software. The texts aren't describing mythology, they're recording data, vast spans of observational astronomy that should be impossible for a civilization that supposedly began around 3100 BCE. Certain papyri, the ones that survived suppression or were leaked from private collections, contain calculations for planetary movements with accuracy that demands consistent observation across millennia. Not casual observation by individual priests across generations, but systematic record-keeping, institutional memory preserved through civilization collapses and dynastic changes. The texts reference invisible stars that affect earthly events, planets not visible to naked eye observation. Modern astronomy knows these as the outer planets, bodies requiring telescopes to see clearly. Yet Egyptian texts describe their movements, their cycles, their influences on the earth below. The alignment of pyramids and temple complexes reveals another layer of this astronomical sophistication. The three main pyramids at Giza align with Orion's belt, but not as it appeared when the pyramids were supposedly built around 2500 BCE. They align with Orion's position around 10,500 BCE, during what Egyptian texts call the Zep Tepi, the first time. Either the pyramids were constructed then, or their builders deliberately commemorated that specific moment in astronomical time, encoding knowledge of stellar positions from 8,000 years before their own era. Research into these alignments exists, conducted by archaeoastronomers who calculated precise correlations between temple orientations and ancient stellar positions. Their papers, submitted to mainstream journals, were rejected not for mathematical errors or faulty methodology, but for proposing impossible chronologies. One researcher documented how the temple complex at Karnak encodes the entire precession cycle through its architecture, with different sections oriented to different stellar ages, spanning the full 26,000-year wobble. His work was dismissed as coincidence, pattern-seeking in random data, despite the mathematical precision involved. Temple reliefs depict instruments whose purpose remains officially unknown, sophisticated devices that appear designed for precise celestial measurement. Modern reconstructions of these instruments, based on the detailed carvings, demonstrate they could function as advanced astronomical tools, capable of measuring angles to fractions of degrees, tracking planetary positions across the sky, and recording long-term celestial patterns. Yet orthodox archaeology insists they're purely religious symbols, ceremonial objects with no practical function. The texts describe knowledge houses where priests maintained continuous astronomical records across dynasties, institutions specifically designed to preserve observational data through generations. These libraries, these astronomical archives, were targeted during various invasions throughout Egyptian history: the Persian conquest, the Greek takeover, the Roman occupation. Each saw systematic destruction of these record houses. What survived were fragments, pieces of a system that once spanned thousands of years of careful observation. This wasn't supernatural knowledge. It didn't require divine revelation or alien intervention. It simply required what Egypt demonstrably possessed: institutional stability, lasting thousands of years, resources to support dedicated astronomical observers, and cultural values that prioritized preserving knowledge across generations. A civilization that could build pyramids that still stand after 4,000 years could certainly maintain observational records across similar time spans. The question isn't whether they possessed such knowledge. The fragments prove they did. The question is why acknowledging this sophistication threatens our understanding of human history so fundamentally that the evidence had to be suppressed. But this astronomical knowledge wasn't theoretical abstraction. The texts describe how it was applied to practical technology, to construction, to purposes we're only beginning to understand. The building texts at Edfu Temple read like technical manuals, translated through the filter of religious language, descriptions of construction processes, using terminology that makes modern translators uncomfortable. The words describe procedures involving what translates as harmonic resonance, alignment of forces, and channels for the unseen energies. Orthodox Egyptology interprets these as mystical concepts, religious metaphors for spiritual rather than physical processes. But what if the religious language is simply the vocabulary available to describe technical knowledge? We've lost the framework to understand. Papyri fragments recovered from restricted collections describe the manufacture of specific temple instruments requiring metal alloys whose composition appears nowhere else in Egyptian archaeology. Modern analysis of certain ancient Egyptian metalwork has found combinations of elements that shouldn't be possible with accepted Bronze Age. Metallurgy copper alloys containing trace elements in precise ratios that require controlled smelting conditions beyond what simple furnaces could achieve. The texts describe preparation processes, specific heating cycles, ingredients we can't definitively identify from their ancient names. The knowledge was systematic, technical, and apparently effective. We have the artifacts, even if we can't fully explain their manufacture. Construction texts describe mortars and cements prepared through processes involving specific chemical reactions. Researchers analyzing mortar from certain ancient Egyptian structures have found compounds that modern chemistry struggles to replicate, adhesives with properties that don't match any known ancient recipe, bonding strength that exceeds what simple lime mortar should achieve, and resistance to weathering that has preserved structures for millennia. The texts describe the preparation, ingredients, mixing procedures, specific conditions required. But the ingredient names don't match anything in the modern chemical inventory, leaving us with instructions we can't quite follow for results we can't quite replicate. Medical papyri contain passages that orthodox archaeology separates from the acceptable medical knowledge of ancient Egypt. The Ebers papyrus and Edwin Smith papyrus describe surgical procedures requiring anatomical understanding that shouldn't exist without systematic dissection, knowledge of blood circulation patterns, nerve pathways connecting specific body regions, organ systems functioning as integrated networks. Egyptian religious beliefs supposedly prohibited human dissection, yet these texts demonstrate intimate knowledge of internal anatomy. The procedures described match modern surgical techniques with uncomfortable precision: cataract removal using instruments inserted through specific entry points, bone setting following principles of orthopedic medicine, pharmaceutical preparations whose chemical mechanisms of action we can now verify through modern analysis. Certain passages describe devices that official translations render as religious or mythological rather than technical. References to stones that hold images of distant places and devices that speak across distances appear in temple inventories and priestly records. The language is ambiguous, certainly, but the descriptions include specific materials required, construction processes, and intended functions that sound uncomfortably like communication and recording technology, described in terms available to ancient writers. Dismissing these as mythology is safe. Taking them seriously as garbled descriptions of lost technology is professionally dangerous. Temple acoustic research reveals another suppressed dimension of Egyptian technical knowledge. Certain chambers demonstrate precise acoustic properties, resonance frequencies, harmonic amplification, sound wave channeling that requires sophisticated understanding of physics. The building texts describe proper construction of these spaces using specific proportions and materials to achieve particular acoustic effects. Orthodox interpretation treats this as accidental, coincidental properties that emerged without understanding. But the consistency across multiple sites, the mathematical precision of the ratios involved, and the text's specific instructions suggest intentional acoustic engineering. Researchers who analyzed these texts as technical documentation rather than religious poetry found systematic principles, consistent methodologies, and practical applications that made engineering sense. Their papers faced immediate resistance, not because the technical analysis was flawed, but because accepting ancient Egyptians possessed this level of systematic technical knowledge challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization. Development. The knowledge described wasn't magical. It was methodical, accumulated across centuries of experimentation and institutional memory, preserved in texts that later generations would misinterpret as mythology. But perhaps the most suppressed knowledge wasn't technical at all. It was historical, the text's descriptions of where this knowledge came from, how old it truly was, and what preceded the Egypt we think we know. Egyptian texts return repeatedly to the Zep Tepi, the first time, a foundational period appearing throughout religious literature, temple inscriptions, and historical records. Orthodox Egyptology interprets this as creation mythology, symbolic time when gods established cosmic order before human history began. But the texts don't describe the first time in vague mythological terms. They provide chronological markers, astronomical references, and descriptions of a period when knowledge was established and civilization begun, not through gradual development, but seemingly complete from the start, as if inherited rather than invented. The temple inscriptions at Abydos describe Egyptian civilization not evolving through stages, but beginning in an advanced state, possessing complete knowledge systems that were maintained rather than discovered. The texts refer to the ancestors and those who came before, suggesting the dynastic Egyptians understood themselves as inheritors of something older. The knowledge they possessed, the astronomy, the engineering, the mathematics, wasn't presented as recent discovery, but as preservation, careful maintenance of understanding passed down from earlier times. King lists like the Turin Papyrus extend far beyond comfortable chronology, documenting rulers across 36,000 years with the same documentary format used for accepted historical dynasties. Each entry includes regnal periods, significant events, administrative details, the standard historical record-keeping that we accept for later periods but dismiss as mythology for these earlier entries. The consistency is striking. These aren't wild legendary tales but systematic chronologies that happen to extend human civilization back to periods we insist were pre-civilizational. References to Egypt being populated from the primeval islands destroyed by rising waters appear across multiple texts separated by centuries. These passages describe migration, refugees carrying knowledge from lands that no longer exist, settling in the Nile Valley and establishing civilization with understanding they'd preserved from their lost homeland. The language is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, mythological flood narratives, dim cultural memory of Atlantean legends, or literal accounts of migration following the dramatic sea level rises around 11,600 BCE when melting, Ice Age glaciers inundated coastal regions worldwide. The most controversial passages, the ones most aggressively suppressed, describe Egyptian knowledge as given rather than discovered. Texts reference the Shining Ones who taught the ancestors, those who descended bringing wisdom, the Watchers who established the knowledge systems. The language doesn't clearly indicate who or what these entities were: deified ancestors, survivors from earlier civilizations, literal non-human teachers, or simply poetic descriptions of cultural heroes. The ambiguity itself has been used to dismiss these passages as obvious mythology. But the consistency across thousands of years, the specific knowledge attributed to these teachings, suggests the Egyptians preserved some form of historical memory that doesn't fit comfortable frameworks. Temple inscriptions describe Egypt as remnant of a previous world age, preserving understanding from civilizations that rose and fell in cycles before the current age. This cyclic view of history, repeated rises and collapses of human civilization across vast time spans, fundamentally contradicts the linear progressive narrative that dominates modern historical thinking. If human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, if our current age is just the latest iteration, then progress isn't inevitable, and our technological advancement isn't unprecedented. The implications disturbed institutions whose entire worldview rested on linear development from primitive to advanced. Academic papers proposing these chronologies be taken seriously as historical record rather than mythology faced decades of rejection. Researchers who analyzed geological evidence supporting Nile Valley habitation during periods officially considered pre-civilizational found their work dismissed regardless of data quality. The Sphinx shows water erosion patterns, suggesting exposure during periods of high rainfall, periods ending around 10,000 years or more before the present, correlating precisely with the first-time dating in suppressed texts. Geologists confirmed the erosion patterns. Archaeologists insisted the dating was impossible. The conflict was never resolved, merely buried under institutional resistance to revolutionary implications. These texts might combine mythological elements with historical memory. They might use symbolic time frameworks rather than literal chronology. But the consistency of these accounts across millennia, the specific correlations with geological and astronomical evidence, and the systematic suppression of research taking them seriously, suggests they preserve something real. The memory of human civilization extending far deeper into the past than we've been allowed to believe. Knowledge inherited from ages that preceded the Egypt we think we know. If these texts describe such ancient knowledge, inherited from earlier ages and preserved across millennia, then the natural question becomes unavoidable. If this civilization possessed such understanding, why did they eventually lose it? What happened to cause knowledge this profound to fade into fragments and suppressed texts? The answer requires understanding not just what they knew, but how civilizations collapse and what gets lost in the darkness between ages. When people mourn the Library of Alexandria, they're grieving the wrong loss. That famous library, burned sometime between Caesar's invasion and the Arab conquest, contained mostly Greek texts, translations, commentaries, and philosophical works written by scholars who'd already filtered Egyptian knowledge through Hellenistic perspectives. The real catastrophe happened centuries earlier, in moments far less famous but infinitely more devastating, when conquerors specifically targeted the original Egyptian temple libraries, where priests had protected ancient knowledge for thousands of years. The first documented systematic destruction came with the Persian conquest of 525 BCE. Cambyses II didn't just conquer Egypt militarily, he waged war against Egyptian culture itself, ordering the burning of temple complexes and the execution of priests who resisted. Ancient accounts describe his soldiers specifically targeting temple libraries, buildings where scrolls and papyri had accumulated across millennia. The priests who survived reported not just the loss of texts, but the destruction of entire knowledge systems, records that stretched back to Egypt's earliest dynasties, astronomical observations accumulated across thousands of years, medical knowledge refined through countless generations. What Cambyses understood, perhaps, was that controlling Egypt required destroying the cultural memory that made resistance possible. The Ptolemaic Greeks brought a different kind of destruction, subtler but equally effective. When Greek scholars began translating Egyptian texts during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, they selected carefully. Works that aligned with Greek philosophy, that confirmed Hellenic assumptions about mathematics and astronomy, received careful translation and preservation. But texts describing chronologies that extended beyond biblical frameworks, cosmologies incompatible with Greek thought, or technologies the Greeks couldn't understand or didn't value, these were set aside, gradually deteriorating in neglected archives until they disintegrated into dust. The Christian era brought ideological purging. 4th and 5th century records document the systematic closure of Egyptian temples, the forced dissolution of priest classes that had maintained ancient traditions without interruption since pharaonic times, and the burning of libraries containing what Christian authorities termed demonic wisdom. Early Christian writings, preserved ironically because they documented the faith's triumph, boast about destroying Egyptian texts. The accounts describe burning sorcerous knowledge and eliminating pagan deceptions, language that likely referenced astronomical tables, engineering manuals, and historical chronologies, whose only crime was contradicting Christian cosmology. The Arab conquest introduced yet another filter. Islamic scholars, to their credit, preserved significant Greek and Egyptian knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Baghdad's House of Wisdom became repository for texts rescued from Egyptian libraries. But specifically, religious Egyptian texts, temple rituals, and esoteric knowledge systems, describing cosmologies incompatible with Islamic monotheism, faced destruction or concealment. Medieval Arab historians recorded discovering libraries in Egypt containing books of the ancients, vast collections subsequently destroyed or sent to Baghdad, where they vanished from record, lost during that city's later catastrophes. Each conquest targeted specific knowledge types. Engineering texts and mathematical tables, practically useful regardless of ideology, sometimes survived. But texts describing Egyptian chronologies, origin accounts, or cosmological frameworks that contradicted conquerors' religious narratives were specifically eliminated. The pattern wasn't random violence, but calculated suppression of ideas deemed dangerous to new order. The destruction extended beyond physical texts. Knowledge systems require not just written records but living communities who can interpret them. Egyptian priests maintained oral traditions explaining how to read hieroglyphs beyond their literal meanings, interpretive frameworks that transformed technical texts into comprehensive knowledge systems. When priests were killed, dispersed, or forcibly converted, these interpretive chains broke. Texts might physically survive, but without the community who understood their deeper meanings, they became increasingly opaque, until even literate readers couldn't fully comprehend what ancient writers had recorded. By the time scholars began seriously studying Egyptian texts in the 19th century, they were examining remnants fragments that had survived multiple rounds of ideological purging, selected by conquerors for survival based on compatibility with foreign frameworks, stripped of interpretive communities who once understood their complete meanings. The knowledge wasn't lost accidentally. It was systematically eliminated during ideological transitions, each wave of destruction targeting what the previous destruction had missed. But was all knowledge truly lost? Or did some survive, hidden in forms that conquerors didn't recognize as knowledge at all? When the temple doors closed for the final time and the last generation of priests died without successors, Egyptian knowledge didn't entirely vanish into historical darkness. Some of it went underground, encoded in symbols and geometry, preserved in traditions that disguised themselves as religion or craft practice, waiting in forms that conquerors wouldn't recognize as the very knowledge they sought to eliminate. The question isn't whether this hidden transmission occurred. Documentary evidence proves it did, but how much knowledge survived and in what forms? The Egyptian mystery schools, documented extensively in both Egyptian and Greek sources, operated on principles designed specifically to survive institutional destruction. Temples at Karnak, Dendera, and Philae functioned as multi-tiered educational institutions, teaching astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy through decades-long curricula. The structure itself was protective. Outer teachings available to general students, middle teachings requiring years of study and demonstrated capability, inner teachings accessible only after completing the entire program. This meant knowledge existed at multiple levels. Even if outer institutions fell, the deepest knowledge might survive in those who'd reached the final initiations. Greek and Roman accounts document this transmission directly. Pythagoras studied in Egyptian temples for over 20 years before returning to establish his philosophical school, preserving geometric and mathematical principles learned from Egyptian priests. Plato's academy, according to ancient sources, taught doctrines derived from Egyptian cosmology and philosophy. These weren't vague mystical influences, but specific knowledge transmissions, mathematical constants, astronomical observations, philosophical frameworks that Greek thinkers acknowledged came from Egypt and which they deliberately encoded in their teachings for preservation. The encoding went deeper than philosophical schools. Egyptian temples themselves functioned as three-dimensional textbooks, with geometric proportions and astronomical alignments embedding knowledge in permanent stone form. The ratios used in temple construction encoded mathematical constants, architectural principles demonstrated engineering knowledge, astronomical alignments preserved observational data information readable to those trained in the interpretive system, but invisible to conquerors seeing only religious architecture. The temples protected knowledge by making it structural rather than merely textual. Hieroglyphic writing operated on multiple levels that modern translation often flattens. Pictorial representation served basic literacy needs. Phonetic values enabled administrative communication. But the symbolic dimension conveyed complex philosophical and scientific concepts to readers trained in deeper interpretation. The same text could communicate simple narrative to casual readers, while encoding sophisticated knowledge to initiated students, a built-in protection against suppression. The Corpus Hermeticum, attributed to the Egyptian god Thoth in his Greek form Hermes Trismegistus, survives as example of this encoded transmission. Modern academics dismiss these texts as Hellenistic forgeries from the early Christian era, products of Greek and Egyptian cultural mixing with no genuine ancient content. But closer analysis reveals concepts, astronomical knowledge, and philosophical frameworks that align remarkably with authentically ancient Egyptian sources, suggesting these texts preserve real Egyptian teaching, encoded in Greek philosophical language knowledge, disguised in forms that could survive periods when explicitly Egyptian sources were being destroyed. Islamic scholars preserved fragments through different channels, translating Egyptian texts on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine that Christian authorities had ignored or tried to eliminate. Medieval alchemists, often dismissed as superstitious gold seekers, preserved encoded Egyptian knowledge of chemistry, metallurgy, and transformation processes in symbolic language that protected information from religious persecution. Craft guilds, particularly architectural and stonemason organizations, transmitted practical knowledge across generations through selective teaching and hands-on application. the geometric principles used in Gothic cathedral construction, the mathematical constants embedded in medieval architecture, the engineering techniques enabling impossible-seeming constructions. These bear signatures of knowledge that traces back through Islamic scholars and Byzantine builders to Egyptian sources. Modern analysis continues, revealing knowledge encoded in Egyptian monuments in ways that wouldn't be recognizable without advanced mathematical and astronomical tools. The Great Pyramid encodes the mathematical constant pi in its proportions, the speed of light in its coordinates, the circumference of Earth in its measurements, knowledge embedded so deeply that it waited thousands of years for humanity to develop the mathematical framework to recognize what was there all along. The transmission wasn't perfect. Much was lost, distorted, or misunderstood as it passed through cultures with different frameworks and priorities. But the fact of preservation remains. Some knowledge survived precisely because it hid in forms conquerors didn't recognize as the wisdom they sought to destroy. Yet even these hidden preservation efforts couldn't save everything. Entire categories of Egyptian knowledge were lost completely, knowable now only through fragmentary references to texts and teachings that no longer exist. Egyptian texts repeatedly reference knowledge systems that once existed, but survive now only as ghosts mentioned in passing, cited as sources, described in fragments too small to reconstruct what was lost. These references create a map of absence, showing the outline of what Egyptian civilization possessed, but what subsequent destructions eliminated completely. What survives isn't the knowledge itself, but proof that it existed, tantalizing evidence of sciences we can no longer access. The books of Thoth appear throughout Egyptian literature as the complete repository of astronomical, mathematical, and spiritual wisdom. Multiple sources reference these works, describe their contents, cite them as authorities, but no complete copies survive. We have fragments, later commentaries, second-hand descriptions from Greek and Arab scholars who claim to have seen the originals, but the actual texts vanished sometime between the late Egyptian period and the Islamic conquest. What little can be reconstructed suggests comprehensive astronomical tables spanning vast timespans, mathematical systems for calculating celestial movements, and philosophical frameworks, unifying physical observation with metaphysical understanding. Medical texts reference complete books of healing, containing knowledge beyond what survives in existing papyri. The Edwin Smith and Ebers Papyrus, our best surviving medical texts, explicitly identify themselves as copies of older, more comprehensive works that are now lost. These sources described surgical procedures, diagnostic techniques, and pharmaceutical preparations that would fill gaps in our understanding of Egyptian medical capability, knowledge that later Arab physicians mentioned having access to, but which disappeared as libraries burned during the Crusades, Mongol invasions. Temple inscriptions reference engineering manuals containing instructions for construction techniques, material preparation, and architectural principles. The building texts at Edfu explicitly cite these sources, noting they're following the writings of the ancestors in the temple's design. These manuals would answer fundamental questions about Egyptian construction capabilities, how they cut and moved massive stones, what tools and techniques enabled their architectural achievements, what knowledge systems supported their engineering, but the actual instruction texts no longer exist. Historical records that Manetho cited when compiling his Egyptian history in the 3rd century BCE no longer survive. Manetho had access to temple libraries still intact, reading original sources from the earliest dynasties, consulting records that stretched back to Egypt's foundations. His chronology, which modern scholars partially accept, was synthesized from these now lost documents. What else? Those sources contain detailed historical accounts, administrative records. Cultural information vanished when the libraries Manetho consulted were subsequently destroyed. Cosmological texts, describing Egyptian understanding of the universe's structure, existed according to multiple references, but survive only as fragments. Works explaining the relationship between celestial and terrestrial phenomena, detailing mathematical principles underlying natural laws, describing observational astronomy with precision that later Greek and Islamic scholars acknowledged surpassed their own capabilities, all referenced, all lost. Religious philosophical texts that explained the symbolic systems underlying Egyptian mythology would transform our interpretation of what survives. Egyptian religion appears as superstition to modern readers, largely because the explanatory texts that revealed its philosophical sophistication were specifically targeted for destruction by monotheistic conquerors, who saw them as dangerous competition. What remains are rituals without the treatises explaining their meaning, symbols without the interpretive keys, references without the comprehensive frameworks they referenced. Fragments continue emerging from museum collections, sometimes misidentified for decades, occasionally recognized as pieces of lost works. Each discovery provides glimpses of vanished knowledge while highlighting how much remains gone forever. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeological exploration intensified, something changed. Excavations began recovering fragments of this lost knowledge, pulling texts from tombs and temples that had escaped earlier destructions. And almost immediately, a new form of suppression began, not through burning or destruction, but through modern institutional control, more subtle and more effective than anything ancient conquerors had achieved. The golden age of Egyptian archaeology began in darkness, literally. When archaeologists descended into tombs sealed for millennia during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, their torches cut through air that hadn't moved in 3,000 years, illuminating hieroglyphs that no living person had read since the last Egyptian priest, who understood their full meaning, had died without successor. The scope of what they found overwhelmed every expectation, every theoretical framework, every institutional capacity to process what was emerging from Egyptian sand. The 1881 discovery at Deir el-Bahari changed everything. What began as an investigation into artifact smuggling led to a hidden cache containing 40 royal mummies from Egypt's most powerful dynasties, wrapped not just in linen, but in papyri texts, rolled beside bodies, tucked into burial chambers, preserved in conditions that had kept them readable across unimaginable time. The mummies themselves were extraordinary, but the texts proved more revolutionary. Papyri describing administrative practices, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and historical accounts from periods that supposedly represented Egyptian civilization's primitive beginnings, yet demonstrating sophistication that challenged every assumption about ancient capabilities. 6 years later, a peasant woman digging in the ruins at Amarna uncovered what became the Amarna letters, nearly 400 clay tablets containing international correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and kingdoms across the ancient Near East. The letters revealed Egypt not as isolated civilization but as central node in complex international network, engaging in diplomacy, trade, and knowledge exchange across vast distances. The sophistication of the communication, the geographic range of contacts, the administrative complexity required to maintain these relationships all suggested civilization far more interconnected and developed than conventional narratives acknowledged. The 1891 excavations at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village serving the Valley of the Kings, yielded thousands of ostraca and papyri, describing daily life with extraordinary detail. But buried within mundane accounts of wages and supplies were technical texts describing construction methods, tool-making procedures, and engineering knowledge that workers apparently possessed as common professional knowledge. These weren't theoretical texts for educated elites, but practical manuals used by craftsmen suggesting widespread technical literacy and systematic knowledge transmission that shouldn't exist in supposedly primitive labor. Populations. Each excavation season brought more. Tombs opened to reveal not primitive burial customs, but sophisticated preservation science. Temple complexes yielded astronomical texts, containing calculations requiring observational data, accumulated across not years or decades, but thousands of years of continuous record-keeping. Medical papyri described surgical procedures with anatomical precision that demanded systematic study of human physiology. Mathematical texts demonstrated understanding of complex geometric principles and numerical systems more sophisticated than anything attributed to Bronze Age cultures. The sheer volume overwhelmed existing institutional capacity. Museums received thousands of artifacts, tens of thousands of text fragments, more material than available translators could process in their lifetimes. Items were catalogued, numbered, stored in basement archives, with notation promising future study that for many objects never came. The backlog grew yearly, texts sitting untranslated in museum storage while published. Egyptology continued operating on frameworks established before most of this material was discovered. Political pressures complicated everything. Colonial powers competed to claim Egyptian artifacts, creating situations where excavators spirited materials out of Egypt before proper documentation. dispersing knowledge across global institutions without centralized understanding of what actually existed. Egyptian authorities, struggling to assert control over their own archaeological heritage, implemented regulations that sometimes protected artifacts, but sometimes trapped them in bureaucratic limbo, where neither Egyptian nor foreign scholars could access them. Some tomb discoveries revealed something particularly poignant, evidence that ancient Egyptians themselves knew their knowledge was endangered. Bodies buried with copies of ancient texts, as if attempting to preserve knowledge through periods of chaos. Inscriptions describing the copying of older texts, so the knowledge might continue. The ancients apparently recognized what was being lost even as they tried to save it. The archaeological revolution created both extraordinary opportunity and institutional crisis. Opportunity to fundamentally reshape understanding of human civilization's antiquity and capabilities. Crisis as discoveries contradicted frameworks that academic careers and institutional prestige had been built upon. The texts existed, catalogued, and numbered in museum basements. The question became what would be done with what had been found. And as the texts were translated and their contents understood, archaeologists and institutions faced a choice that would shape the next century of Egyptology. Publish revolutionary findings and upend established history, or find ways to contain what they'd discovered. Archaeological discovery was only the first step. Between excavation and public knowledge stood a gauntlet of institutional processes: cataloguing, translation, analysis, peer review, publication, each stage creating opportunities for filtering, delay, or strategic omission. What emerged in academic journals often bore surprisingly little resemblance to what excavators had described finding in preliminary field notes, and the discrepancies followed patterns too consistent to be coincidental. The normal timeline from discovery to publication involved years. Excavation season, preliminary cataloguing, detailed study back at university, careful translation consulting multiple specialists, peer review by journal gatekeepers, final publication in academic press. For controversial texts, this timeline stretched into decades, or simply never completed. The mechanisms were bureaucratic, almost boring in their mundanity, which made them nearly impossible to challenge. The 1924 discovery of astronomical papyri near Edfu generated immediate excitement in preliminary reports. The texts contained star charts and mathematical calculations demonstrating observational astronomy of extraordinary precision and time depth. Excavators' field notes described their astonishment at the sophistication. But final publication didn't appear until the 1950s, and when it did, key sections were marked damaged beyond reliable translation, or meaning unclear. Field photographs, accessible to scholars who knew where to look, showed the supposedly damaged sections perfectly legible, hieroglyphs crisp and readable. The revolutionary implications simply disappeared between discovery and publication. Institutional mechanisms enabled this filtering systematically. Excavation permits required reporting all findings to Egyptian authorities, but translations and interpretations remained controlled by European institutions. Peer review gave journal editors power to reject papers challenging established chronologies regardless of evidence quality. Archaeologists dependent on continued site access learned quickly which findings advanced careers and which ended them. The pressure to publish acceptable results and avoid controversy became self-enforcing. No conspiracy required, just professional survival instinct. Split publication became common strategy for managing problematic texts. Technical aspects, mathematical formulas, astronomical data, linguistic analysis appeared in specialized academic journals, with circulation of hundreds. General audience publications emphasized religious or mythological interpretations that maintained comfortable narratives. The same text existed in two forms: revolutionary in obscure technical journals, safely conventional in widely read sources. Knowledge was technically public, but functionally suppressed through dispersal. Certain scholars developed habit of publishing texts with preemptive interpretive framing. Translations would be accompanied by commentary explicitly stating, "This cannot be taken literally," or clearly mythological exaggeration, when presenting chronologies or knowledge claims contradicting accepted frameworks. The evidence was published, technically, but wrapped in interpretation that neutralized its revolutionary potential before readers encountered the actual content. Later editions of published texts sometimes showed quiet revision. Initial translations proposing extended chronologies or advanced knowledge would be moderated in subsequent printings toward conventional understanding, changes made without acknowledgement or explanation. Comparing first editions to later versions revealed systematic movement away from challenging implications, as if the texts themselves were being domesticated over time. Grey literature, preliminary reports, internal museum documents, conference presentations sometimes contained more honest discussion than formal publications. Scholars at conferences privately acknowledged implications they couldn't publicly endorse in peer-reviewed journals. Excavation reports circulated internally, described findings more completely than published versions. The knowledge existed, but in forms that didn't count as real academic publication, easily dismissed as preliminary or speculative. Photographic records occasionally revealed more than published translations acknowledged. Images showed inscriptions catalogued but never translated, papyri fragments mentioned in inventory lists but never transcribed, artifacts photographed during excavation but absent from final site reports. The evidence existed in museum archives, but remained functionally invisible without published translation, making it accessible to broader scholarship. The pattern distinguished itself from understandable resource limitations. Some delays reflected genuine challenges, underfunded departments, limited specialist availability, technical translation difficulties, but texts remaining untranslated for 50-plus years despite institutional resources, or published translations diverging dramatically from what independent scholars could read in published photographs, suggested something more systematic than simple backlog. The selection wasn't random. Texts confirming accepted chronologies received prompt, thorough publication. Texts describing sophisticated knowledge systems appeared primarily in technical journals. Texts proposing dramatically extended timelines languished indefinitely in understudy status. The pattern created a published record that systematically underrepresented the most revolutionary aspects of what excavations had actually discovered. The texts were found and catalogued, documented, and photographed. But what appeared in journals decades later sometimes bore little resemblance to what excavators described finding in their field notes. And the scholars who insisted on publishing controversial findings anyway discovered that challenging consensus came with costs that extended far beyond academic debate. Academic disagreement typically involves published rebuttals, conference debates, collegial argument about interpretation and evidence. But scholars who challenged Egyptian chronology or proposed advanced ancient knowledge faced something different. Not refutation but exclusion, not debate but professional erasure, patterns of consequence that revealed how much was at stake in maintaining accepted narratives about human civilization's development. René Adolphe Schwaller de Lubitsch spent decades at Luxor in the early and mid-20th century, producing meticulous documentation of Egyptian temples with particular focus on mathematical and astronomical sophistication encoded in their architecture. His measurements were precise, his mathematical analysis rigorous, his conclusions revolutionary. Egyptian civilization possessed knowledge of advanced geometry, harmonic principles, and astronomical observation far exceeding what conventional Egyptology acknowledged. He published extensive work, detailed measurements, mathematical proofs. Mainstream Egyptology largely ignored it, labeling his approach mystical despite its mathematical precision. His books went out of print, his theories dismissed without serious engagement, his decades of careful work relegated to fringe status, not through refutation but through institutional silence. John Anthony West built on Schwaller's foundation in the late 20th century, particularly regarding the Sphinx's age. He noticed water erosion patterns on the Sphinx and surrounding enclosure inconsistent with the accepted construction date around 2500 BCE. These patterns matched erosion from sustained rainfall, but Egypt's climate had been arid since approximately 10,000 BCE, suggesting the Sphinx was far older than officially recognized. West brought in professional geologist Robert Schoch, who confirmed the erosion analysis. Geological evidence pointed to construction during periods of higher rainfall, ending thousands of years before pharaonic Egypt supposedly began. Egyptological authorities rejected the conclusion, not by disputing the geological evidence, but by asserting it must be wrong, because it violated chronological consensus. West and Schoch faced professional consequences. West denied speaking positions at archaeological conferences. Schoch's work marginalized within his own geology department. The evidence remained unrefuted, simply declared unacceptable. The pattern repeated across decades. Scholars proposing Egyptian knowledge of advanced astronomy faced rejection from journals, their papers returned without serious review. Researchers documenting sophisticated engineering principles in pyramid construction were denied site access for future study. Archaeologists whose chronologies extended beyond accepted frameworks found themselves excluded from academic conferences, unable to present findings to peers. The consequences weren't loud or dramatic. No public denunciations, no formal condemnations, just quiet exclusion that ended careers as effectively as any overt suppression. Tenure committees rejected candidates whose research contradicted established timelines, regardless of methodological rigor. Site permit authorities denied access to researchers who'd published controversial interpretations, effectively preventing them from gathering further evidence to support or refine their claims. Research funding flowed toward projects confirming consensus, while proposals challenging chronology were deemed not promising enough for investment. The institutional mechanisms functioned smoothly, professionally, making suppression look like quality control. The personal toll was substantial. Scholars spent careers in academic isolation, groundbreaking research published by small presses rather than academic publishers. Legitimate credentials marginalized alongside actual pseudoscience because conclusions were equally unwelcome to institutional gatekeepers. Some researchers began within mainstream institutions but were gradually pushed out as their work led to increasingly uncomfortable conclusions, the implicit message clear: conform or leave. This created selection effect that reinforced itself. Scholars willing to challenge Egyptian chronology increasingly came from outside academic structures, which enabled dismissing their work as not serious scholarship because it came from non-institutional sources, a perfect self-reinforcing circle protecting consensus from challenge. Modern examples showed patterns persisting into the digital age. Researchers using AI and mathematical modeling to analyze Egyptian texts found patterns suggesting greater sophistication than conventional interpretation acknowledged. Their work faced difficulty in Egyptological journals, but was published in mathematics, computer science, and linguistics journals, where the analytical methods were taken seriously. The findings existed in academic literature, technically, but remained invisible to Egyptology because they appeared in wrong venues. These scholars weren't infallible. Some made overreaching claims, some interpretive errors were real, but their core evidence deserved engagement rather than dismissal, and the systematic pattern of professional consequences for challenging consensus pointed to gatekeeping based on protecting established narratives rather than evaluating evidence on its merits. Scholars didn't just lose debates about Egyptian chronology, they lost careers, site access, and any hope of academic legitimacy, regardless of evidence quality. But why does any of this matter now? What difference does it make whether ancient Egypt was older or more advanced than officially recognized? The answer requires understanding that this isn't just about the past. It's about what we're allowed to believe about human civilization's capabilities and potential. Ancient Egypt endured for over 3,000 years by conservative estimates. Longer if the suppressed texts are taken seriously, one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. A knowledge tradition spanning more time than separates us from the fall of Rome. Yet, within a few centuries of institutional collapse, most of what they knew had vanished. Libraries burned, priestly traditions died without successors, technical knowledge disappeared, leaving only fragments and monuments whose construction methods we still debate. A civilization that's stable, that enduring, lost nearly everything. We should find that terrifying, because we're far more fragile than they were. Consider what we depend on. Digital information requires functioning electrical grids, compatible hardware, software that can read decades-old file formats. Specialized knowledge concentrates in institutions vulnerable to disruption: universities, research centers, corporate laboratories, where expertise exists in small communities of practice. Scientific and technical knowledge demands complex educational systems, resource investment, and continuous institutional support to maintain. Break those systems, and watch how quickly capability evaporates. We've seen it happen repeatedly on smaller scales. Roman concrete, the material that built the Pantheon, and aqueducts still standing after 2 millennia, used a formula that was lost during the Dark Ages. Modern concrete crumbles after decades. Roman structures endure for centuries. We only partially reconstructed their technique in the 21st century through chemical analysis of ancient samples. The knowledge existed, was used widely, then vanished completely when the institutional structures maintaining it collapsed. Medieval European societies lost Greek mathematical and scientific knowledge that had to be reintroduced through Arabic translations centuries later. Knowledge that had existed in their own cultural predecessors, but was lost during transitional chaos. Indigenous technologies and medicines vanished with colonization. Capabilities were only now partially recovering through archaeological analysis and consultation with surviving knowledge keepers. Damascus steel, whose molecular structure we can examine, but whose production process remains mysterious. Greek fire, the Byzantine weapon whose formula was lost completely. Stradivarius violins, whose acoustic properties modern luthiers can measure but not reproduce despite having the actual instruments to study. These weren't primitive technologies, they represent sophisticated knowledge that existed, functioned, then disappeared when the communities and institutions maintaining them were disrupted. Modern civilization accelerates this vulnerability. How much contemporary technology could we recreate if manufacturing infrastructure was disrupted? How many people understand the principles underlying the devices they use daily? How dependent are we on electronic storage systems requiring continuous institutional and infrastructural support? Research on knowledge loss shows how quickly specialized skills disappear when communities disperse or institutions fail. Entire technical capabilities can vanish within a single generation if transmission chains break. Egyptian knowledge loss illuminates our present vulnerability. They had advantages we lack: stone construction that survives millennia, institutional stability spanning thousands of years, knowledge encoded in multiple forms, including architecture and ritual, that could survive even if texts were lost. We depend on fragile electronic storage, rapid institutional change, and specialized knowledge concentrated in vulnerable expert communities. If ancient Egypt, with its advantages, lost most of its accumulated wisdom within centuries of collapse, what would happen to our far more fragile knowledge systems under similar stress? Understanding how they lost knowledge and how fragments survived provides insights for modern preservation. The importance of distributed storage knowledge, existing in multiple locations and formats, encoding in durable forms not just digital files but physical structures, practical applications, and knowledge embedded in social practices. Institutional redundancy ensuring critical knowledge exists across different organizational structures, so single-point failures don't eliminate capabilities. Transmission across cultures, knowledge that can move between different societal frameworks, survives better than knowledge locked in single cultural contexts. Modern initiatives unconsciously parallel ancient preservation strategies. Seed vaults, preserving genetic information in multiple global locations. Digital preservation projects, maintaining redundant archives. Indigenous knowledge documentation efforts, recording traditional practices before elder generations pass. These mirror Egyptian strategies, multiple preservation methods, distributed storage, encoding in various forms, suggesting humans repeatedly recognize and respond to knowledge vulnerability across different eras. The suppression of Egyptian texts matters because it eliminated information about how they preserved and transmitted knowledge across vast time spans. We face the same challenges they did, arguably under more difficult conditions. Studying how they succeeded for millennia and how they ultimately failed could inform our own preservation strategies. But beyond preservation logistics, what did Egyptian knowledge contain that we might actually need? What capabilities and understandings have we lost that could benefit us now? The assumption that ancient knowledge is automatically inferior to modern understanding is itself an ideological position worth questioning. Egyptian civilization sustained dense populations in arid environments for thousands of years, built structures still standing when modern buildings crumble after decades, and developed sophisticated systems we're only beginning to appreciate. The suppressed texts might contain practical solutions to problems we're currently struggling with, not magic, but accumulated knowledge from a civilization that succeeded at challenges we now face. Egyptian architecture endures with a persistence that embarrasses modern engineering. The pyramids, temples, and megalithic constructions have survived earthquakes, climate changes, and millennia of weathering using techniques we don't fully understand. This isn't accident or divine intervention, it represents sophisticated knowledge of materials science, structural principles, and environmental adaptation. Texts describing construction methods that were suppressed or dismissed as mythological might contain engineering insights applicable to sustainable building, particularly for creating durable structures using local materials with minimal industrial processing. In an era concerned with sustainable architecture and reducing construction's environmental impact, Egyptian knowledge of long-lasting, low-impact building could offer valuable alternatives to contemporary approaches. Medical texts describing pharmaceutical preparations using local plant materials, surgical techniques requiring minimal tools, and diagnostic methods based on detailed observation might supplement modern medicine, particularly in resource-limited contexts. The sophistication of Egyptian medical knowledge that survives in fragments suggests the suppressed texts contained even more advanced information. Their integration of physical and psychological healing, their understanding of how environment affects health, their long-term observational knowledge accumulated across thousands of years, these represent alternative medical frameworks that might address limitations in purely technological approaches to health. Egyptian agricultural practices sustained civilization in one of Earth's harshest environments. Irrigation systems that functioned for millennia without depleting water resources, soil management, maintaining fertility across centuries of intensive use, crop selection and rotation optimized for arid conditions, knowledge directly relevant to modern water scarcity and agricultural sustainability challenges. Texts describing these practices in detail could inform contemporary efforts to develop sustainable food systems for growing populations in increasingly challenging climatic conditions. Their astronomical knowledge enabled accurate calendars, precise navigation, and long-term prediction without requiring technological infrastructure. These knowledge systems could function in any context, potentially valuable for maintaining civilizational coordination if modern technological systems faced disruption. The suppressed text describing how they achieved such precision with apparently simple tools might reveal observational and mathematical techniques applicable to low-technology contexts or as backup systems for technology-dependent societies. Egyptian metallurgy produced alloys we can't reproduce. Their stoneworking achieved precision we can't explain with known tools, and their material preparations show chemical compositions that remain mysterious. Analysis of surviving artifacts demonstrates capabilities that shouldn't be possible with Bronze Age technology, yet the artifacts exist. Texts describing these processes, dismissed as mythological or exaggerated because they claim impossible precision or sophistication, might actually contain practical knowledge encoded in unfamiliar terminology. Materials science could potentially advance by investigating these claims seriously rather than dismissing them as primitive exaggeration. Water management systems described in suppressed texts, using terms that translate to concepts like energy channeling and harmonic principles, sound fantastical, but might represent practical engineering knowledge we're misinterpreting through modern conceptual frameworks. Ancient descriptions of invisible forces and celestial influences might encode knowledge about magnetic fields, gravitational effects, or other physical phenomena they observed without having our technical vocabulary to describe. Investigating these claims as potential practical knowledge rather than dismissing them as superstition could yield unexpected insights. Egyptian integration of astronomy, architecture, medicine, and philosophy into unified knowledge systems represents alternative to modern disciplinary fragmentation. Their holistic approach, where different knowledge domains informed each other systematically, might enable more comprehensive problem-solving than contemporary specialized expertise allows. The suppressed texts describing this integration could offer models for interdisciplinary knowledge organization relevant to complex contemporary challenges requiring multiple expertise domains. This isn't claiming Egyptian knowledge is magically superior or that ancient approaches always surpass modern ones. Much may be genuinely lost, some ancient techniques may be inferior to modern equivalents, and practical recovery may be impossible. But the automatic assumption that ancient knowledge has nothing to offer contemporary challenges deserves questioning. The suppressed Egyptian texts might contain practical solutions we need, or at least alternative perspectives on problems where modern approaches have limitations. Recovering this knowledge requires first acknowledging what was lost and why it was suppressed. A reckoning with how we decide what knowledge is valuable and who gets to make that decision. The pattern throughout this documentary reveals something uncomfortable. Knowledge wasn't suppressed randomly but systematically when it challenged established religious, political, or academic frameworks. This creates a fundamental problem for any society claiming to value truth. If the authorities determining what knowledge is valid, which have institutional interests in maintaining certain narratives, how can we trust their determinations about what to preserve, publish, or teach? Contemporary knowledge authority operates through specific mechanisms that seem neutral but carry inherent biases. Peer review systems where gatekeepers share common training and assumptions, often unconsciously filtering out challenges to their frameworks. Funding structures directing research towards certain questions while starving others of resources, shaping what knowledge can even be generated. Educational curricula determining what the next generation learns and therefore what they can think, creating self-perpetuating limitations on acceptable inquiry. These systems often produce good results, maintaining quality and preventing obvious errors, but they're also vulnerable to systematic bias, where only certain perspectives reach decision-making positions. History provides sobering examples of expert consensus being completely wrong. Continental drift was dismissed for decades, despite substantial evidence, because it contradicted geophysical assumptions experts had trained in. Bacterial causes of ulcers were ridiculed for years despite reproducible research because expert consensus insisted stress and diet were responsible. Meteorite impacts were rejected as impossible before being accepted as fundamental to planetary geology and extinction events. In each case, mechanisms meant to ensure quality instead suppressed truth because it contradicted established expert frameworks, not through conspiracy, but through honest conviction that consensus represented knowledge rather than just current. Institutional agreement. This plays out with Egyptian texts in predictable ways. Experts trained in specific chronologies and interpretive frameworks evaluate new evidence through those frameworks, often unconsciously dismissing what doesn't fit rather than questioning whether frameworks need revision. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Consensus determines what's acceptable. Accepted positions determine who receives institutional positions. Institutional authorities determine what becomes new consensus. Breaking this cycle requires either overwhelming evidence that can't be dismissed, or generational turnover, replacing old frameworks, both processes taking decades during which revolutionary insights remain suppressed. Modern technology introduces new dynamics. Internet access enables amateur researchers to examine museum collections digitally, identifying patterns or raising questions institutional scholars missed or avoided. Computational analysis can process vast datasets without the unconscious biases human experts bring, sometimes revealing structures in ancient texts that challenge conventional interpretation. Crowdsourced research occasionally outperforms institutional scholarship by bringing diverse perspectives to evidence. Knowledge authority is dispersing, creating both opportunities and problems. The tension defies easy resolution. Democratic knowledge evaluation enables valuable challenges to institutional consensus, but also spreads misinformation without expert gatekeeping to filter obvious errors. Pure expert authority maintains quality, but risks systematic bias and suppression of revolutionary insights. Balancing these requires institutional humility about current understanding's limits while maintaining standards preventing obvious nonsense. Healthy knowledge systems might require multiple competing frameworks existing simultaneously, transparent access to evidence, allowing independent evaluation, mechanisms for challenging consensus without career destruction, tolerance for uncertainty and competing interpretations, and institutional structures rewarding challenge to established views rather than only conformity. Egyptian texts were suppressed, partly because no such systems existed. Religious and political authorities controlled knowledge absolutely, eliminating challenges before they could develop into alternative frameworks. We face similar dynamics with modern knowledge authority. Institutional structures determining what's true often have reasons to maintain certain narratives. This doesn't make all expert knowledge suspect, but it demands critical engagement with how knowledge authority functions and who benefits from particular consensus positions. Beyond these political questions, though, the suppressed Egyptian texts point towards something even deeper, a fundamentally different understanding of time, history, and human civilization's place in the vast sweep of deep time that challenges how we think about progress itself. Modern civilization tells itself a comforting story. Humanity progressed steadily from primitive to advanced, occasionally suffering setbacks, but following an overall upward trajectory from caves to cities to space stations. We are the pinnacle of human achievement, unprecedented in our capabilities, the first civilization to reach this level of sophistication. Egyptian texts, the ones that were suppressed or dismissed as mythology, describe something entirely different, not one human civilization but many, rising and falling in recurring patterns across time spans that make recorded history seem like a brief moment in a much longer story. The cyclic framework appears repeatedly in Egyptian sources, references to ages or successive worlds, each reaching heights of achievement before being destroyed and replaced by the next cycle. The Zep-Tepi, the first time, described not as the beginning of civilization, but as a peak of knowledge and capability that subsequent Egyptian civilization was attempting to preserve rather than achieve originally. These aren't vague mythological references, but systematic descriptions of civilizational succession, complete with chronological markers and specific accounts of what was lost and what was preserved between cycles. The geological record supports the possibility of such cycles more than comfortable narratives admit. Multiple catastrophic events punctuate human history: asteroid impacts that would devastate modern civilization, supervolcanic eruptions causing years-long winters, ice age transitions creating abrupt climate shifts that would destroy current agricultural systems. Each of these events, documented in geological strata and ice cores, could reset human civilization if they occurred during a period of advanced development. The Earth doesn't care about human progress. It cycles through catastrophes on timescales that make even long-lived civilizations temporary. Archaeological evidence presents anomalies that cyclic frameworks might explain. Sophisticated structures whose construction methods we can't replicate with known ancient tools, suggesting possibly different or lost capabilities. Advanced astronomical knowledge appearing suddenly in early civilizations without apparent developmental progression, as if inherited rather than discovered. Multiple ancient cultures independently developing similar architectural principles, mathematical constants, and astronomical observations, perhaps not through independent invention, but through inheriting fragments from earlier cycles. Genetic and linguistic evidence shows human populations bottlenecking and dispersing multiple times in deep history, patterns consistent with periodic catastrophic reductions, followed by repopulation. These aren't theoretical models, but measurable genetic signatures showing human population crash to small numbers repeatedly, events that would destroy any existing civilizational structures while leaving survivors to rebuild from fragments of what was lost. The cyclic framework fundamentally reorients historical understanding. If civilizations rose and fell before our accepted timeline, then peoples we call primitive might be descendants of previous advanced civilizations rather than ancestors of future ones, carrying degraded fragments of earlier knowledge rather than representing humanity's baseline. Anomalous artifacts and knowledge wouldn't be impossibilities but remnants from previous cycles, survivors of earlier achievements. Human history might span not 5,000 or 10,000 years, but hundreds of thousands or millions of years of recurring civilization, vast expanses of time where multiple complete cycles of rise and fall occurred before the Egypt we recognize. Modern science independently arrives at similar conclusions through different routes. Studies of civilizational collapse identify common patterns: resource depletion, environmental degradation, institutional failure, suggesting cycles might be inevitable rather than accidental. Climate research reveals recurring catastrophic patterns in Earth systems. Systems theory describes how complex structures inevitably reach critical points where they collapse and reorganize, patterns operating at all scales from ecosystems to civilizations. Contemporary scientific frameworks are rediscovering what ancient texts encoded. Cycles are fundamental to how complex systems behave. The psychological difference between linear and cyclic time frameworks matters beyond abstract philosophy. Linear progressive narratives emphasize novelty and advancement, assuming current civilization is fundamentally different from and superior to what came before. Cyclic frameworks emphasize pattern recognition and preservation, acknowledging that much might be rediscovery rather than discovery, that ancient peoples might have faced and solved problems we're only now encountering. Cyclic thinking creates humility, recognition that we're neither the first nor necessarily the best, that what we build might collapse like previous cycles, that learning from patterns matters more than assuming we're unprecedented. The systematic dismissal of cyclic frameworks without serious examination might itself be ideological rather than evidential, reflecting modern civilization's need to believe in its own uniqueness and permanence, rather than weighing evidence objectively. Egyptian texts describe not one human civilization but many, rising and peaking and collapsing across time spans, where our entire recorded history becomes merely the latest chapter in a much longer and more repetitive story. But if civilizations have risen before, what caused them to fall? And are we facing similar threats that could trigger another cycle? The geological record documents nightmares, events that would end modern civilization, preserved in rock strata and ice cores as evidence that catastrophes capable of destroying everything we've built happen not just once, but repeatedly. Egyptian texts describing impossible destructions, floods covering continents, fire falling from the sky, the world itself turning over might not be mythology at all, but literal accounts, distorted by time and translation, of the last time it happened. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides uncomfortable alignment with Egyptian chronology. Evidence suggests a major cosmic impact or airburst around 10,800 BCE nanodiamonds in sediment layers, impact markers across multiple continents, abrupt climate shifts visible in ice cores, mass extinctions of megafauna that had survived previous climate changes. The event triggered rapid temperature drops, environmental chaos that would devastate any existing human populations and obliterate any civilizations they had developed. The timing aligns eerily with Egyptian first-time dating, with geological evidence of the catastrophe and textual evidence of civilization's foundational moment converging at the same deep time period. The subsequent sea level rise makes the alignment more compelling. As Ice Age glaciers melted between 11,600 and 8,000 BCE, oceans rose over 120 meters, inundating coastlines where early human settlements would most likely have developed flat, fertile, maritime accessible areas perfect for civilization building, now hundreds of feet beneath ocean surfaces. Egyptian texts repeatedly reference the waters rising and the first lands being covered, descriptions usually dismissed as flood mythology, but which might be historical memory of actual sea level rise drowning. Developed coastal civilizations, forcing survivors inland to rebuild with fragments of what was lost. Earlier catastrophes punctuate deeper time. The Toba supervolcanic eruption 74,000 years ago created a volcanic winter lasting years, reducing human population to perhaps 10,000 individuals, according to genetic evidence, a bottleneck that would eliminate any existing civilizational structures while leaving genetic signatures we can still measure. Multiple asteroid impacts throughout human history show that civilization-destroying events aren't ancient history, but recurring threats. Solar events powerful enough to destroy electrical infrastructure and collapse technological civilization without directly killing populations remain regular possibilities, documented in historical records and ice cores showing previous occurrences. Modern civilization's vulnerability to these recurring threats creates uncomfortable parallels with what Egyptian texts describe. Our dependence on electrical grids means even moderate solar storms could cause civilizational collapse through infrastructure destruction. Climate instability from volcanic or impact events would devastate agricultural systems feeding 8 billion people. Sea level rise from ice sheet collapse would inundate every major coastal city where most human population and economic activity concentrates. We've built a civilization exquisitely vulnerable to exactly the catastrophe types that geological records show happen regularly on timescales longer than recorded history, but shorter than human existence. Egyptian textual descriptions of catastrophes align disturbingly well with geological evidence. Fire from the sky matches impact scenarios or volcanic supereruptions. The world turning over could describe massive geographical upheavals from tectonic mega-events, or the psychological experience of survivors watching their entire world collapse. The waters covering the lands precisely describes post-Ice Age inundation patterns. These aren't impossible mythological events, but documented geological phenomena that ancient peoples might have witnessed and remembered. Contemporary science takes these risks seriously in ways that validate ancient concerns. NASA tracks potentially hazardous asteroids, maintaining databases of objects that could devastate civilization. Geologists monitor supervolcano systems like Yellowstone, Toba, and Campi Flegrei, knowing they could trigger global catastrophes. Climate scientists model abrupt shift scenarios, where current climate stability breaks suddenly rather than changing gradually. Modern risk assessment independently concludes that civilization-destroying events remain threats, not ancient history but recurring dangers, requiring active monitoring. The Sphinx water erosion evidence adds another convergent data point. Geological analysis showing exposure to rainfall patterns ending around 10,000 BCE aligns with both Egyptian first-time dating and global catastrophe timing. Multiple independent evidence streams pointing toward the same deep time period when something significant happened, when conditions changed, when perhaps a previous cycle ended and a new one began. The geological record shows that events capable of destroying civilization happen repeatedly. Egyptian texts describing impossible catastrophes might be literal accounts from survivors of the last occurrence. And we remain as vulnerable as they were. If catastrophes have destroyed advanced civilizations before, what survives these cycles? How does knowledge pass from one age to the next, across the abyss of civilizational collapse? When civilization collapses, what survives? When institutional structures fail, populations scatter, and complex knowledge systems dissolve, how does understanding cross the gap to inform whatever comes after? Egyptian approaches to knowledge preservation suggest they understood this challenge intimately, developing strategies that modern civilization is only beginning to appreciate as we contemplate our own long-term survival. Physical preservation in protected locations represents the most direct method. Egyptian pyramids and temples were built with durability as primary concern, suggesting awareness that knowledge needed to survive far into the future structures that would endure catastrophes, destroying lesser constructions. Temple inscriptions carved in the hardest stone, with redundancy across multiple sites, ensured knowledge would survive even if individual locations were destroyed. Mystery school systems designed to preserve understanding through human transmission provided backup when physical repositories were threatened. The redundancy wasn't accidental but deliberate strategy, multiple preservation methods ensuring something would survive even when individual approaches failed. Modern civilization employs similar strategies without always acknowledging ancient precedents. Nuclear waste warning systems designed to communicate danger across 10,000 years face the same challenges Egyptian knowledge keepers confronted: how to create messages that remain intelligible across cultural transformation, language change, and potential civilizational collapse. Seed vaults, preserving genetic information in protected locations, mirror Egyptian architectural preservation. Digital archiving with distributed redundant storage parallels the strategy of inscribing the same texts across multiple temple sites. We're rediscovering preservation principles they apparently understood millennia ago. Architecture itself becomes knowledge repository when designed intentionally. Mathematical constants embedded in monument proportions, the Great Pyramid, encoding pi, the speed of light, Earth's dimensions in its measurements create permanent records that survive when papyri decay. Astronomical data, encoded in structural orientations and dimensions, preserves observations across millennia. Technical knowledge embedded in construction methods. The structures themselves demonstrate capabilities, teaching through example rather than explanation. Buildings become three-dimensional textbooks that endure when written texts don't. Oral tradition demonstrates knowledge can survive without writing. Indigenous Australian traditions preserve accurate information about sea level changes from 10,000 plus years ago, passed through hundreds of generations without written records. Polynesian navigation knowledge spanned thousands of years through oral transmission, maintaining practical technical information with extraordinary accuracy. Vedic texts were preserved orally with precision. Modern scholars verify by comparing versions from separated communities, demonstrating that knowledge doesn't require writing to cross vast time spans if transmission systems are properly designed. Symbolic encoding offers another preservation layer. Complex information can be preserved in myths, symbols, and rituals that carry meaning even when original context is lost. The zodiac, potentially encoding astronomical precession cycles, geometric sacred symbols carrying mathematical relationships, stories embedding practical knowledge in memorable narrative forms, information architecture designed to survive cultural transformation. Egyptian emphasis on symbols and sacred geometry might represent deliberate encoding. The Ankh, the Eye of Horus, the D-Jade pillar, potentially carrying technical or philosophical information in forms that would survive even if explicit explanations were lost. Modern information theory wrestles with these same challenges. How to encode critical information for extremely long-term preservation. How to create messages remaining intelligible across cultural change. How to distinguish important signals from noise across deep time. Ancient knowledge keepers confronted these problems and developed solutions we're only beginning to appreciate. Their strategies, architectural encoding, symbolic systems, oral tradition, ritual preservation, represent sophisticated information science applied to multimillennial timescales. Emerging research on genetic and epigenetic transmission suggests another possibility: ancient peoples might have understood better than we do. Some information might pass biologically across generations, potentially explaining intuitive knowledge or common cross-cultural insights that seem to emerge without obvious transmission mechanisms. While speculative, the possibility that knowledge can encode itself in biology as well as culture opens frameworks for understanding how information might survive even complete cultural collapse. Multiple transmission methods create resilience. Physical texts in protected locations provide direct record. Architectural encoding offers permanent backup. Oral traditions maintain living knowledge. Symbolic systems carry meaning through cultural transformation. Biological transmission potentially preserves some information, even when all cultural mechanisms fail. The redundancy ensures something survives, even when individual methods don't. These aren't mystical processes, but practical information preservation strategies that civilizations, with thousands of years of institutional stability, develop to sophisticated levels. Strategies we might need to learn as we consider our own civilization's survival across potential catastrophes. Knowledge doesn't need books to survive catastrophe. It can be encoded in stones lasting millennia, oral traditions spanning thousands of years, and symbols carrying meaning across cultural collapse. But knowledge transmission is only valuable if what's being transmitted contains truth, which brings us back to the fundamental question: what did ancient Egyptians actually know? Stone doesn't lie. You can suppress texts, prevent publication, discredit researchers, and control academic narratives, but you can't hide the measurements of monuments standing in open desert, where anyone with modern surveying equipment can verify what ancient builders achieved. The physical evidence speaks in a language of mathematics and precision that transcends interpretation, telling us definitively about capabilities the Egyptians possessed, regardless of debates about how or why they possessed them. The Great Pyramid's construction demonstrates accuracy that challenges our assumptions about ancient capabilities. Alignment to true north within 1/15 of a degree precision, requiring surveying techniques we can't definitively explain with known ancient tools. The four sides length variation, measuring less than 2 inches across bases, spanning 755 feet consistency, demanding organizational systems and measurement standards maintained across decades of construction. Internal chamber construction showing load distribution, understanding that matches modern structural engineering principles, knowledge of forces, weights, and material properties sophisticated enough to create structures surviving 4,000 years without significant collapse. These measurements aren't interpretive. They're calculable, verifiable, reproducible by anyone with appropriate equipment. They establish definitive capabilities. Mathematical systems enabling exact calculations, surveying methods achieving extraordinary accuracy, organizational frameworks maintaining consistency across massive timescales, and understanding of materials and structural mechanics, recognizable as sophisticated by contemporary engineering standards, even if we can't replicate their specific methods. Astronomical alignments encode information resistant to suppression. The Great Pyramid's shafts align to specific stars at specific dates, orientations calculable through astronomical software and verifiable against ancient stellar positions. Temple complexes across Egypt orient to particular celestial events, encoding mathematical constants like pi and phi in their proportions, relationships measurable and demonstrable through geometric analysis. These aren't accidents or approximate alignments, but precise mathematical relationships between structure and cosmos, requiring both observational astronomy and computational capability to achieve intentionally. Acoustic properties in certain temple chambers reveal another dimension of verifiable knowledge. The Dendera Temple's hyperstyle hall demonstrates measurable resonance frequencies, sound wave behaviors requiring understanding of acoustic principles, architectural features designed to produce specific sonic effects. Modern acoustic analysis documents these properties objectively: frequencies, wavelengths, resonance patterns that emerge from chamber geometry and material selection. The consistency across multiple sites suggests intentional acoustic engineering rather than fortunate accident. The Dendera zodiac ceiling presents astronomical data in stone form. Stellar positions corresponding to specific time periods, precession awareness encoded in the layout, Mathematical relationships, in the positioning and symbolism, information that survives whatever debates surround interpretation. The ceiling is both artifact and astronomical calculation made permanent, preserving data independently of textual records that could be destroyed or hidden. The Osirion at Abydos presents physical evidence challenging accepted chronology. Massive megalithic blocks weighing hundreds of tons, construction techniques completely different from dynastic Egyptian building styles, weathering patterns suggesting greater age than official dating physical characteristics that raise questions regardless of interpretive frameworks applied to them. The structure exists, its features are measurable, and those measurements complicate comfortable chronological narratives. Modern analytical techniques continue revealing new monument data. Laser scanning documents details invisible to naked eye observation, revealing tool marks, construction sequences, and precision details. Ground-penetrating radar identifies hidden chambers and subsurface structures, expanding understanding of monument complexity. Acoustic analysis documents sonic properties systematically across sites. Astronomical simulation calculates original alignments, determining what ancient builders could see from specific locations at specific times. Each technology enables reading monuments as texts that ancient builders left encoded in stone, waiting for future generations to develop analytical tools sophisticated enough to decode what was preserved. The monument evidence establishes definable baseline. Ancient Egyptians possessed mathematical sophistication, surveying precision, astronomical knowledge, structural engineering understanding, and organizational capabilities sufficient to create works that challenge modern engineering. We can measure these capabilities definitively. What we can't fully explain is how they achieved them with the tools and techniques our models of ancient technology allow, suggesting either our models are incomplete or our assumptions about ancient capabilities require revision. You can suppress texts and silence scholars, but you can't hide the Great Pyramid's measurements, which demonstrate capabilities we still can't fully explain. But monuments alone can't tell us everything. What happens when we apply modern analytical techniques to the texts themselves? When computational linguistics met ancient Egyptian texts, something unexpected emerged. Texts that generations of scholars had read as religious mythology or primitive superstition revealed statistical patterns, inconsistent with those interpretations, structural characteristics matching technical documentation rather than storytelling, mathematical relationships embedded in symbol sequences, information architecture suggesting intentional multi-layered encoding rather than simple narrative communication. Frequency analysis of hieroglyphic texts shows patterns traditional translation methods miss. Certain religious texts demonstrate consistent terminology usage, systematic symbol relationships, and structural characteristics that statistical analysis associates with technical manuals rather than mythological literature. The patterns suggest these texts weren't recording beliefs but encoding information, using religious or mythological frameworks as containers for systematic knowledge. Natural language processing applied to Egyptian corpus reveals what researchers describe as multi-layered meaning structures. Surface narrative reads as mythology stories of gods, creation accounts, ritual descriptions, but deeper analysis identifies numerical patterns, symbol sequences correlating with astronomical data, geometric relationships encoded in narrative structure. The texts appear designed to communicate at multiple levels simultaneously. Accessible stories on the surface, technical information encoded beneath, mathematical relationships structuring both. Egyptian mathematical papyri, when analyzed computationally, reveal more sophistication than traditional interpretation acknowledged. The Rind and Moscow mathematical papyri contain not just calculation procedures, but theoretical mathematical reasoning. Problem-solving approaches show systematic understanding of mathematical principles rather than empirical trial and error. Geometric calculations demonstrate knowledge enabling accurate determination of areas, volumes, and complex proportions, mathematics recognizable as sophisticated by modern standards, even if notation and methods differ from contemporary approaches. Astronomical data encoded in texts emerges through computational analysis. King lists contain chronological information that correlates with astronomical cycles when analyzed mathematically. Religious texts describing stellar movements show precision, requiring long-term systematic observation and mathematical calculation of celestial mechanics. Architectural texts encode astronomical constants through numerical symbolism that becomes visible when subjected to statistical analysis, searching for mathematical relationships. Machine learning analysis of hieroglyphic symbol usage identifies consistent patterns, suggesting intentional information architecture. Certain symbols appear reliably in mathematical or astronomical contexts, their usage patterns indicating specialized meaning beyond literal translation. Symbol combinations create meta-meanings, information conveyed through relationships between symbols rather than individual symbol definitions. Structural patterns across texts suggest they were designed as integrated knowledge systems rather than isolated documents, with cross-references and consistent encoding schemes enabling information retrieval across the corpus. Computational analysis validates interpretations that traditional scholarship dismissed. Texts claiming extreme antiquity show linguistic characteristics consistent with those claims when analyzed statistically. Texts describing advanced knowledge contain mathematical patterns, supporting rather than contradicting those descriptions. The cross-referencing between texts reveals coherent knowledge systems rather than isolated mystical beliefs, suggesting systematic knowledge preservation rather than mythological elaboration. Modern information theory concepts illuminate ancient encoding methods. Error correction principles explain textual redundancy that seemed unnecessary. The repetition served information preservation across transmission. Information compression concepts reveal how symbolic condensation enabled complex knowledge encoding in compact forms. Fractal mathematics identifies self-similar patterns in text structures at different scales, suggesting sophisticated information architecture principles. Specific examples demonstrate the power of computational approaches. Pyramid texts analyzed for mathematical sequences reveal numerical patterns encoding astronomical data. Medical texts show statistical characteristics consistent with empirical research, methodology, systematic observation, hypothesis testing, outcome documentation. Astronomical texts encode data in formats optimized for information preservation and transmission across generations, structure recognizable to modern information scientists, even when content remains partially mysterious. These analytical methods don't require believing extraordinary claims about ancient capabilities. They simply reveal information structures that traditional translation methods weren't designed to detect, patterns suggesting Egyptian texts encoded systematic knowledge using religious and mythological frameworks as containers, creating documents readable at multiple levels, depending on reader sophistication and analytical tools available. When computer analysis is applied to supposedly mythological Egyptian texts, they reveal mathematical patterns and information structures suggesting they're not stories but encoded knowledge systems. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence emerges when we compare Egyptian texts to other ancient traditions. The patterns suggest something larger than isolated cultural achievement. Egyptian texts describing catastrophic floods, advanced ancient knowledge, and wisdom from those who came before aren't unique. Ancient traditions worldwide contain strikingly similar accounts, too consistent and too detailed to dismiss as coincidence or universal human myth-making. The patterns suggest either shared origins, knowledge transmission across ancient civilizations, or multiple independent cultures, preserving memory of actual events that shaped human history globally. Flood narratives appear across continents with remarkable consistency. Egyptian accounts of first lands destroyed by rising waters align with Mesopotamian Gilgamesh epic, describing global inundation. Hebrew Noah narrative, preserving similar chronology. Hindu Manu story describing humanity's near extinction through flooding. Native American traditions across tribes describing world-destroying waters, and Pacific Islander accounts of ancestral lands disappearing beneath oceans. The geographic distribution spans the globe. The chronological details, when analyzed, cluster around 11,600 BCE, precisely when geological evidence documents dramatic sea level rise as Ice Age glaciers melted, raising oceans over 120 meters and inundating coastlines where early human settlements would most likely have developed. Astronomical knowledge shows cross-cultural sophistication that standard diffusion models struggle to explain. Egyptian, Mayan, and Mesopotamian civilizations independently developed sophisticated calendars tracking celestial cycles with extraordinary precision. All three encoded astronomical data in monumental architecture. All three demonstrated awareness of precession cycles requiring observational continuity across thousands of years. Either they achieved this sophistication independently through parallel development, they were in contact, sharing knowledge, or they inherited from earlier civilizations that possessed this understanding and transmitted it through multiple channels. Architectural patterns present similar mysteries. Massive megalithic construction appears in Egypt, Peru, Easter Island, and other globally distributed sites, using remarkably similar techniques: precision-fitted blocks without mortar, astronomical alignments, acoustic properties designed into chamber spaces. The technical similarities suggest either contact, parallel independent development of identical solutions, or inheritance from shared earlier tradition that influenced multiple later civilizations. Mathematical knowledge crosses cultures with suspicious consistency. The golden ratio phi appears in Egyptian pyramid proportions, Greek Parthenon dimensions, Hindu temple geometry, and Mayan architectural relationships. Pi encodes itself in monuments from Egypt to China. Sophisticated geometric principles enable precision construction across civilizations that supposedly developed in isolation. These mathematical constants could represent universal human discovery, but the specific ways they're employed and encoded show remarkable parallels suggesting knowledge transmission or shared source. Medical traditions show parallel sophistication. Surgical techniques described in Egyptian papyri match procedures in ancient Chinese texts and Indian Ayurvedic writings. Pharmaceutical preparations, using different local materials but similar chemical principles, appear across traditions. Anatomical understanding suggesting systematic study appears in Egyptian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican sources. Knowledge that supposedly developed independently but demonstrates consistent principles and practices. Cosmological frameworks mirror each other across cultures that supposedly had no contact. Egyptian cyclic time concepts parallel Hindu world ages, Mayan calendar cycles, and Buddhist temporal frameworks. Descriptions of catastrophic transitions between ages, recurring patterns of rise and fall, and civilizational succession appear consistently. Philosophical frameworks too similar to attribute entirely to coincidence or universal human psychology. Textual parallels create the most intriguing patterns. Egyptian texts describe the Shining Ones teaching ancient wisdom. Mesopotamian sources reference the Watchers, providing civilizational knowledge. Hindu texts describe the Devas, transmitting understanding. Mesoamerican accounts mention gods bringing knowledge. Different names, different languages, but consistent narrative structure. Advanced beings or previous civilizations, transmitting knowledge to humanity, teaching astronomy and agriculture and architecture and mathematics, then departing or being destroyed, leaving inheritors to preserve what they could. Recent archaeological discoveries complicate comfortable isolation models. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey demonstrates sophisticated construction and astronomical knowledge 12,000 years ago, period when civilization supposedly didn't exist. Evidence of transoceanic contact appears earlier than accepted chronology allows. Genetic and linguistic data shows human populations moved and mixed more extensively than previously recognized, creating contexts where knowledge transmission across ancient civilizations becomes more plausible than traditional models admitted. These patterns challenge consensus frameworks fundamentally. If ancient civilizations developed in isolation, why do they show such consistent knowledge, identical techniques, and parallel narratives? If they were in contact, how given accepted chronology and technology? If they inherited from earlier civilizations, where's the evidence? Often these questions aren't addressed but avoided. Papers proposing diffusion, face rejection, evidence of early sophistication gets minimized. Parallels are attributed to coincidence without deeper investigation. Egyptian texts describing impossible knowledge aren't alone. Ancient traditions worldwide contain strikingly similar accounts of advanced wisdom, catastrophic loss, and knowledge from those who came before. These worldwide connections raise a fundamental question. Are we looking at remnants of a previous global civilization, or something else entirely? Before exploring speculative possibilities, intellectual honesty requires establishing what the evidence definitively supports, the minimal interpretation that anyone examining the data objectively should accept, regardless of their philosophical frameworks or comfort with revolutionary claims. This conservative reading alone demands significant revision of how we understand ancient Egypt and human history, without requiring belief in lost continents, extraterrestrial contact, or any extraordinary mechanism beyond documented human capability. The evidence establishes with high confidence that ancient Egypt possessed mathematical, astronomical, engineering, and medical knowledge significantly more sophisticated than typically represented in educational systems and popular understanding. This isn't speculation but measurable fact. Pyramid precision, astronomical alignments, surgical techniques, mathematical calculations all demonstrate capabilities requiring systematic knowledge, accumulation, and transmission. The sophistication isn't primitive trial and error, but recognizable scientific methodology. Egyptian civilization maintained institutional stability across millennia, enabling knowledge accumulation impossible in shorter-lived cultures. 3,000 years at minimum, possibly significantly longer, based on textual and archaeological evidence that extends pre-dynastic sophistication further back than comfortable chronologies accommodate. This institutional continuity created conditions for multi-generational projects, long-term observational astronomy, and knowledge refinement across centuries, advantages no modern civilization has matched. Certain texts and research were systematically suppressed or delayed when they challenged accepted chronologies or knowledge frameworks. This isn't conspiracy theory but documented pattern-specific texts, remaining untranslated for decades, despite resources, publications delayed or modified between field notes and final versions, researchers facing professional consequences for challenging chronological consensus. The mechanisms are documentable through institutional records, correspondence, and publication patterns. Physical monuments demonstrate capabilities we can measure but don't fully understand, using accepted ancient tool inventories and techniques. The precision exists, verifiable through modern surveying. The structural engineering sophistication is calculable through contemporary engineering analysis. The astronomical knowledge is determinable through computational simulation. What remains unclear is how these capabilities were achieved with the technological base we attribute to Bronze Age civilizations, suggesting either our models of their capabilities are incomplete or our assumptions require revision. Patterns across multiple ancient civilizations suggest either contact, shared origins, or parallel development we haven't adequately explained through conventional diffusion models and chronologies. The similarities are too specific, too consistent, too widespread to dismiss as coincidence or universal human psychology. Either ancient peoples were more connected than we recognize, they inherited from shared earlier sources, or we're missing fundamental aspects of how knowledge develops and spreads. This minimal interpretation alone revolutionizes understanding. Egyptian civilization likely extends further back than accepted First Dynasty, dating around 3100 BCE. Archaeological and textual evidence points toward 5000 to 7000 BCE or earlier for sophisticated pre-dynastic culture. The knowledge systems employed were genuine sciences, not religious mysticism, disguised in symbolic language. They observed, calculated, experimented, and transmitted understanding systematically. The suppression happened for documentable, institutional, ideological, and political reasons we can trace through records and correspondence. And we've lost significant knowledge through institutional collapse, deliberate destruction, and inadequate preservation that we should acknowledge and mourn. Even this conservative reading challenges powerful narratives. Religious frameworks dependent on biblical chronology, placing creation around 4000 BCE, can't accommodate sophisticated Egyptian civilization existing before that date. Academic careers, built on specific timelines, face disruption if those timelines require significant revision. Educational systems structured around linear progressive development from primitive to advanced don't accommodate ancient peoples possessing sophisticated sciences. Cultural assumptions about modern superiority and ancient inferiority require examination if ancient capabilities approached or exceeded ours in certain domains. The resistance to even minimal acknowledgement of Egyptian sophistication reveals the stakes. Why are demonstrable capabilities controversial? Why does documenting systematic suppression make institutions defensive? Why does suggesting Egyptian civilization might be older or more advanced than accepted provoke strong reactions rather than curious investigation? The resistance itself suggests these questions threaten something beyond simple historical chronology. They challenge fundamental narratives about progress, civilization, and human development. Accepting this conservative interpretation creates foundation for further investigation. If Egyptians were this sophisticated, what else might they have known that we've lost? If suppression happened systematically, what else might remain hidden? If our chronology is wrong by even a few thousand years, how comprehensively does that error propagate through our understanding of human history? The questions compound, each answer opening new uncertainties. Whether one accepts more speculative interpretations or not, the conservative reading alone demands that we acknowledge ancient Egypt was far older, more sophisticated, and more deliberately suppressed than we're typically taught, and that this has implications extending far beyond Egyptology into how we understand human capabilities and institutional truth-telling. But the evidence permits, even if it doesn't require, more expansive interpretations frameworks that might better explain the full pattern of data we've examined. Beyond what evidence definitively requires lie interpretations that the data permits speculative frameworks that might explain patterns. The conservative reading leaves mysterious. These aren't proven facts but hypotheses worth considering, their plausibility varying based on evidence quality and explanatory power. The line between conservative and speculative isn't sharp but gradual, with some frameworks having substantial support while others remain provocative possibilities. The advanced earlier civilization hypothesis proposes that sophisticated civilizations existed before 10,000 BCE, were destroyed by catastrophic events, and that Egyptian and other ancient civilizations preserved fragments of their knowledge. What supports this? Consistent narratives across cultures, describing previous ages and catastrophic destructions. Younger Dryas impact evidence aligning with these accounts chronologically, architectural and knowledge sophistication appearing suddenly in advanced form without clear developmental progression. Global patterns suggesting possible shared knowledge sources predating accepted civilization origins. This framework would explain why Egyptian texts describe receiving knowledge from those who came before, rather than discovering it themselves. Why certain capabilities appear fully formed at civilization's supposed beginning. Why similar knowledge appears in geographically separated cultures. Why ancient peoples invested massive effort in preserving knowledge for the future they knew from experience that catastrophes erase civilizations and wanted to protect understanding for whatever came after. The knowledge inheritance hypothesis, slightly less speculative, proposes that Egyptians preserved knowledge from earlier human civilizations. We haven't identified archaeologically because their remains are underwater from sea level rise, buried under desert from climate change, or simply unrecognized in sites we've attributed to later periods. This explains references to knowledge from the drowned lands, the emphasis on preservation and transmission, the sophisticated understanding without apparent experimentation periods, and the global knowledge patterns we've documented. The contact and exchange hypothesis suggests ancient civilizations were more connected than accepted chronology permits, sharing knowledge through trade, migration, or conquest, far earlier than mainstream archaeology acknowledges. Supporting evidence includes genetic mixing earlier than expected, technological and knowledge similarities across distant cultures, archaeological evidence of far-reaching trade networks, and linguistic connections, suggesting contact. This framework requires no lost civilizations or catastrophes, merely acknowledgement that ancient peoples traveled and communicated more extensively than we've recognized. The cyclic civilization hypothesis proposes that human civilization has risen to sophisticated levels multiple times, been destroyed by natural catastrophes, and rebuilt, with each cycle reaching similar or varying peaks. This explains consistent cyclic narratives across cultures, sophisticated knowledge appearing at civilization's beginnings, the emphasis on catastrophe memory and preparation, and evidence for catastrophic events throughout human history. It suggests we're neither the first nor necessarily the most advanced civilization Earth has hosted. More controversial possibilities deserve brief, fair presentation. Could ancient peoples have possessed knowledge we consider modern electricity, advanced materials, sophisticated chemistry, but lost it during civilizational collapse? The evidence doesn't exclude this, though it doesn't strongly support it either. Could they have had contact with non-human intelligence, whether terrestrial species we've lost track of or extraterrestrial visitors? Some researchers seriously propose this, and while speculative, the evidence doesn't absolutely preclude it. Could consciousness or information access work differently than materialist frameworks assume, enabling knowledge transmission through non-physical means? This ventures furthest from conventional science, but remains philosophically possible. These frameworks vary in support levels. Earlier civilization than accepted, well supported by converging evidence. Advanced knowledge inheritance, moderately supported by textual and archaeological patterns. Cyclic civilization, moderately supported by catastrophe evidence and global narratives. Non-human contact or non-physical knowledge transmission, minimally supported, remaining philosophical possibilities rather than evidentially compelling claims. Speculative doesn't mean impossible. Continental drift was speculative before becoming accepted geology. Bacterial disease causation was speculative before becoming accepted medicine. Meteorite impacts were speculative before becoming accepted planetary science. Many now orthodox scientific concepts began as speculation that accumulated evidence eventually validated. The question isn't whether to speculate, but how to speculate productively, generating testable predictions, directing research toward overlooked evidence, challenging assumptions that might constrain discovery. The dangers of speculation are real. It can become untethered from evidence, create unfalsifiable claims, and substitute exciting narratives for rigorous investigation. Healthy speculation maintains connection to evidence, acknowledges uncertainty explicitly, and remains willing to revise when data demands. The evidence doesn't prove but does permit considering. What if human civilization is far older, more cyclical, and more connected than we've been taught? What if catastrophes have repeatedly reset human achievement? What if ancient knowledge systems were genuinely sophisticated rather than primitive? These questions remain open, inviting investigation rather than requiring belief. But regardless of which interpretation comes closest to truth, the pattern of suppression itself reveals something crucial about knowledge, power, and who decides what we're allowed to know. Step back from specific Egyptian claims for a moment and consider what this entire journey reveals, not just about ancient texts, but about how knowledge functions in any society, how truth gets constructed or suppressed, and who holds power to determine what counts as legitimate understanding. The Egyptian suppression story isn't an isolated historical curiosity, but a case study in dynamics that operate continuously, shaping what we know and what remains hidden across all domains of knowledge. The pattern throughout this documentary illustrates fundamental principles. Institutions with power to determine knowledge validity often have incentives to maintain specific narratives, not through malicious conspiracy, but through structural interests in preserving frameworks that justify their authority, protect established careers, and maintain comfortable worldviews. Consensus perpetuates through professional consequences rather than pure evidence. Evaluation scholars learn quickly which conclusions advance careers and which end them. Revolutionary evidence gets systematically excluded through multiple non-conspiratorial mechanisms: peer review, funding allocation, publication, gatekeeping, professional isolation. What counts as legitimate knowledge becomes partly an authority question, not purely evidential determination. This reveals uncomfortable truths about how knowledge works generally. Healthy skepticism toward authority claims becomes necessary while maintaining standards for evidence evaluation. Consensus can be wrong, and mechanisms exist that perpetuate error across generations of experts who inherit flawed frameworks. Suppression doesn't require conspiracy. It emerges naturally from systemic incentives that reward conformity and punish deviation. We must balance expert knowledge with independent critical thinking, neither blindly accepting authority nor reflexively rejecting expertise. The Egyptian pattern appears throughout history and continues today. Scientific theories rejected for decades before acceptance, continental drift, bacterial ulcer causation, impact-driven extinctions. Medical knowledge suppressed for professional or economic reasons, treatments that threaten pharmaceutical profits, public health approaches that conflict with political interests. Historical narratives shaped by political needs rather than evidence uncomfortable truths about national origins, colonialism's impacts, or civilizational violence. Technological capabilities dismissed until patents expire or economic interests shift. The dynamics repeat because the incentives persist. Healthy knowledge systems would require structural changes. Transparent evidence access, enabling independent verification rather than gatekeeping by credential. Multiple competing interpretive frameworks rather than enforced consensus that treats dissent as heresy. Professional incentives rewarding truth-seeking rather than conformity. Tenure, funding, and prestige for challenging rather than confirming established views. Institutional humility about certainty and willingness to revise understanding when evidence demands. The tension between democratizing knowledge evaluation and maintaining expertise has no easy resolution. Democratization enables valuable challenges to authority, but also spreads misinformation without expert filtering. Pure expert authority maintains quality but risks systematic bias and revolutionary insight suppression. The balance requires sophisticated navigation. How can societies benefit from expert knowledge while preventing gatekeeping from suppressing truth? How can we encourage critical thinking while preventing reflexive expertise rejection? How can institutions maintain knowledge quality while remaining open to revolutionary findings? Egyptian text suppression exemplifies ongoing dynamics about who controls knowledge and why. The specific historical case teaches general principles applicable to navigating contemporary information landscapes where similar patterns operate through different mechanisms: algorithmic curation, replacing editorial gatekeeping; platform control, replacing institutional access barriers; attention economy dynamics, replacing traditional publication filters. What individuals can do: develop critical thinking skills enabling independent evidence evaluation; understand institutional incentives, shaping knowledge production and validation; maintain epistemic humility while asserting right to question authority; support systems enabling transparent evidence, access and competing interpretations; recognize that expertise and critical questioning aren't opposed, but complementary. Good experts welcome informed challenges, and good skeptics respect genuine expertise. Hope and caution both seem warranted. Information technology and access democratization might reduce traditional suppression. Anyone can examine museum databases, analyze texts computationally, or publish findings without institutional gatekeeping. But new suppression mechanisms emerge: algorithmic curation, platform control, coordinated information campaigns. The patterns adapt rather than disappear. The point isn't to reject all authority or embrace all alternative claims. It's to develop sophisticated understanding of how knowledge is produced, validated, and sometimes suppressed, skills essential for navigating information-saturated modern existence. Whether ancient Egypt was 5,000 or 36,000 years old, whether they had advanced knowledge or not, the fact that evidence was systematically suppressed for institutional reasons is itself the crucial lesson. Knowledge without authority to question becomes belief. Authority without accountability becomes tyranny, and truth requires both evidence and freedom to examine it. The suppression of Egyptian texts isn't just about ancient history. It's about how societies decide what's true, who gets to decide, and what happens when evidence threatens those decisions. Which brings us back to where we started. What's actually in those forbidden Egyptian texts, and what happens now that we know they exist? The forbidden texts aren't all locked in vaults accessible only to privileged scholars. Many survive in museum collections, digitized and available online, containing the knowledge this documentary has explored, hidden not by dramatic suppression, but by lack of attention, public awareness, and the simple fact that most people don't know these resources exist or how to access them. The pyramid texts, humanity's oldest known religious writings, are carved into pyramid chambers at Saqqara and photographed extensively. They contain astronomical references, mathematical relationships, and cosmological frameworks available for anyone to examine. The coffin texts and Book of the Dead, found in countless museums globally, to preserve knowledge systems that traditional translation reads as funerary religion, but which contain encoded information visible to those looking with different analytical frameworks. The building texts at Edfu and Dendera temples remain on site, photographed, translated, and published in academic works, accessible through university libraries and increasingly through online databases. These inscriptions describe construction principles, knowledge preservation, and connections to earlier ages, using language that deserves serious technical reading rather than purely mythological interpretation. Major papyri collections reside in accessible institutions. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo holds extensive texts, many photographed and catalogued. The British Museum's Egyptian collection includes the Rhind mathematical papyrus, demonstrating sophisticated mathematical reasoning. The Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and museums across Germany, Italy, and other nations hold significant collections, increasingly digitized for online access. Digital revolution transforms accessibility dramatically. Museum databases provide high-resolution photographs of hieroglyphic texts, university projects make translations and images freely available through online portals. Hieroglyphic fonts and basic learning resources enable anyone interested to begin reading original texts rather than relying solely on expert translations. AI translation tools, while imperfect, allow amateur researchers to engage with text directly, identifying patterns or raising questions that professional Egyptology might have missed or avoided. What remains restricted represents the ongoing challenge. Private collections hold texts not accessible to public examination. Museum basements contain uncatalogued or undigitized materials waiting for resources and attention. Some institutions maintain classified archives, texts whose access requires special permissions rarely granted. Fragments whose existence appears in old catalogues, but whose current locations remain unknown or deliberately obscured. Yet recent digitization enables discoveries that validate the democratization of research. Independent researchers using online museum databases have identified patterns professional scholars missed. Computational analysis of accessible texts reveals insights unavailable to traditional close reading. Crowdsourced translation projects identify errors in official versions. Amateur archaeologists examining satellite imagery locate potential sites that receive subsequent professional investigation. Specific controversial texts are surprisingly accessible. King lists showing extended chronologies can be examined in published photographs and translations. Astronomical texts with sophisticated calculations are viewable in museum digital collections. Building texts describing advanced knowledge exist in published scholarly works available through libraries. Medical papyri demonstrating unexpected sophistication are readily available for study. Technology changes knowledge access fundamentally. High-resolution photography reveals details in damaged texts that naked eye observation missed. Computational pattern analysis identifies structures invisible to human readers. Machine translation, while requiring expertise to verify, enables non-specialists to engage meaningfully with texts. Global information sharing enables collaborative research across institutional and national boundaries. Ongoing discoveries continue. Museum collections yield texts previously misidentified or overlooked. Reanalysis of known texts using new methodologies generates new insights. Technological advances enable text recovery from damaged materials through multispectral imaging and other techniques. Occasionally, private collectors release restricted materials, adding to accessible corpus. The suppression isn't always active concealment, often it's passive neglect, institutional inertia, and public unawareness. The texts exist, many freely accessible, containing knowledge discussed throughout this documentary. What's required isn't breaking into vaults, but simply looking, reading, analyzing, and thinking independently about what ancient Egyptians actually wrote, rather than accepting only institutional interpretations of what they meant. The forbidden knowledge waits in plain sight, digitized and online, accessible to anyone willing to look, hidden only by lack of attention, and the assumption that ancient mysteries require expert mediation rather than direct investigation. But beyond examining existing texts, what might still be discovered? What are the frontiers of Egyptian knowledge recovery? The technology for recovering lost Egyptian knowledge advances faster than ever, creating possibilities that would have seemed impossible even decades ago. Hidden chambers, buried texts, encoded meanings that traditional methods couldn't access, all becoming discoverable through emerging analytical capabilities that transform how we can investigate ancient civilizations. Ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing technologies reveal subsurface features without excavation. These tools have already identified previously unknown chambers in the Great Pyramid, hidden temple complexes beneath sand, and buried city structures invisible to surface observation. What else might they find? Sealed chambers in known monuments potentially containing preserved texts, buried libraries or archives beneath sites we've partially excavated. Hidden structures that ancient texts reference, but archaeology hasn't confirmed. Earlier construction layers suggesting pre-dynastic sophistication beyond current recognition. Material science advances enable recovering information from damaged or seemingly blank materials. Multispectral imaging reveals text invisible to naked eye on papyri that appear blank or too damaged to read. Chemical analysis determines ink composition and precise age. Advanced material studies illuminate ancient construction techniques. Genetic analysis of mummies and organic materials provides chronological data and population information challenging accepted timelines. Computational approaches transform text analysis. AI translation improves accuracy, while identifying patterns human translators might miss. Machine learning processes vast text databases, finding connections across documents that manual research couldn't detect. Natural language processing reveals encoded information structures invisible to traditional reading. Network analysis maps knowledge relationships, showing how different texts reference and build upon each other systemically. These technologies already produce results: hidden hieroglyphs revealed through imaging, new pyramid chambers discovered through muon tomography, linguistic patterns identified through computational analysis, mathematical relationships found through statistical processing. Each breakthrough demonstrates capability and suggests further possibilities. Underwater archaeology represents a frontier barely explored. Technologies for underwater survey and excavation improve continuously. Post-Ice Age sea level rise submerged over 120 meters of coastline, where early human settlements would likely have developed. Egyptian coastal cities from pre-dynastic periods might exist beneath Mediterranean and Red Sea waters, preserving evidence of sophistication predating accepted dynastic chronology. Sites that ancient texts describe as drowned or beneath the waters might be literal rather than mythological. Climate change, ironically, enables unexpected discoveries. Desert regions shifting reveal buried structures. Water table changes expose previously flooded sites. Storm events uncover coastal artifacts. Even permafrost melting in unexpected regions reveals human habitation where conventional models insisted none existed. Environmental change, while threatening preservation, occasionally enables discovery. Research democratization continues accelerating. Amateur researchers using publicly available satellite imagery identify potential archaeological sites. Citizen scientists contribute to text translation and analysis projects. Crowdsourced funding enables research lacking institutional support. Independent researchers, freed from academic career constraints, pursue questions establishment scholars avoid, sometimes making genuine contributions. AI in translation represents particularly promising frontier. Machine learning might crack undeciphered scripts by identifying pattern relationships. AI could identify encoded meanings beyond literal translation by analyzing statistical structures. Pattern prediction might recover text from damaged materials by computationally reconstructing probable content. These approaches enable layperson engagement with hieroglyphic analysis, previously requiring decades of specialized training. Specific research frontiers show promise. Re-examining museum collections with new analytical techniques yields ongoing discoveries. Surveying known sites with improved technology reveals features previous archaeology missed. Applying AI to existing text databases identifies connections and patterns. Investigating locations that texts reference but haven't been explored archaeologically might locate corroborating evidence. Institutional evolution, gradually and unevenly, shows encouraging signs. Some museums embrace collaboration and transparency. Certain funding agencies support innovative approaches. Academic journals demonstrate slightly increased receptivity to revolutionary findings. Younger scholars, less invested in established consensus, show greater openness to evidence-led inquiry. Realistic optimism seems warranted. Technology creates possibilities without guaranteeing specific findings. The most important discoveries often come from unexpected directions. Knowledge recovery requires both technological capability and intellectual openness to recognizing what's been found, equipment to detect, and minds willing to acknowledge. The technology to recover lost Egyptian knowledge advances rapidly. Reading damaged texts, finding hidden chambers, decoding encoded meanings, capabilities improving yearly. The next discovery could transform everything we thought we knew. But ultimately, technology only enables discovery if we're willing to acknowledge what we find. Which brings us to the final question. What do we do with this knowledge? We began in a sealed chamber beneath Cairo in 1927, where a British archaeologist found texts that would vanish from history within 48 hours. We've journeyed through centuries of suppression, examined monuments that speak in measurable precision, explored knowledge systems more sophisticated than comfortable narratives permit, and traced patterns, suggesting human civilization might be far older and stranger than we've been taught. Now we face questions more personal than historical. Knowing that texts were suppressed that knowledge was lost, that institutional pressures continue shaping what we're taught, what responsibility do we have to seek truth independently? If ancient civilizations possessed capabilities we've barely acknowledged, what are we missing by maintaining narratives that minimize their achievements? If catastrophes destroyed previous civilizations, what might we learn from their experiences about our own vulnerabilities? Individual choices present themselves clearly: to passively accept institutional narratives or actively investigate evidence, to defer entirely to expert authority or develop critical evaluation skills, to view ancient peoples as primitive or recognize them as sophisticated but different, to see history as settled knowledge or ongoing investigation requiring continuous reassessment as new evidence emerges and analytical capabilities improve. Collective choices matter equally, whether educational systems should present one consensus narrative or acknowledge competing frameworks and unresolved questions, whether research funding should support only conventional questions or also revolutionary inquiries challenging established timelines, whether professional advancement should require conformity or reward genuine discovery regardless of where evidence leads, whether societies can maintain both knowledge, quality, and openness to paradigm-shifting findings. What's at stake personally extends beyond ancient Egypt. This documentary isn't ultimately about hieroglyphs and pyramids, but about how we navigate all information: political, scientific, medical, historical. The skills and perspectives developed through questioning Egyptian narratives apply universally. Examining evidence rather than accepting authority automatically, understanding incentive structures shaping information, maintaining intellectual humility while asserting right to think independently, building frameworks for evaluating competing claims in any domain. What's at stake collectively affects civilization's trajectory. If we can't honestly assess our past, we struggle to wisely navigate our future. If institutions suppress evidence for ideological reasons in one domain, they likely do so in others. If we lose capacity for revolutionary thinking, accepting only incremental modifications to approved frameworks, we stagnate intellectually and culturally. If we can't learn from ancient civilizations' rises and falls, we risk repeating catastrophic patterns they might have experienced and tried to warn against through the texts and monuments they left encoded for whoever came after. Hope and caution both seem appropriate. Hope that information-age technologies might enable recovering lost knowledge and preventing future loss through distributed, redundant preservation. Caution that the same technologies enabling discovery also enable new forms of information control, manipulation, and the drowning of signal in noise that makes truth harder rather than easier to locate. The specific Egyptian chronology question whether their civilization extends back 5,000, 10,000, or 36,000 years might matter less than developing intellectual frameworks to honestly evaluate evidence wherever it leads. The documentary's goal isn't convincing you of specific claims, but demonstrating that claims deserve investigation rather than reflexive dismissal, that evidence exists for those willing to examine it, that suppression patterns should concern anyone valuing truth, and that ancient knowledge might contain insights valuable for contemporary challenges. A call to curiosity feels appropriate here. Read the accessible texts, they're online, digitized, available. Examine the monument data, measurements don't lie, and anyone can verify them. Evaluate the evidence using critical thinking rather than defaulting to either mainstream or alternative narratives. Question both. Think independently. Develop informed perspectives. Remember that every established truth was once a revolutionary claim someone had courage to investigate despite institutional resistance. We circle back to that sealed chamber. Somewhere in archives, basements, and private collections, texts exist, containing knowledge that could transform understanding knowledge, hidden not necessarily by dramatic suppression, but by lack of attention, institutional inertia, and cultural assumptions about what's worth investigating. The greatest tragedy isn't what ancient Egyptians knew and we lost, but what we might continue losing by refusing to acknowledge, investigate, and preserve knowledge that challenges comfortable narratives. The choice is ours: to remain comfortable with incomplete narratives, or to pursue truth wherever evidence leads. The forbidden knowledge isn't just in hidden texts, it's in our willingness to question what we've been taught, examine evidence for ourselves, and accept that truth might be stranger and more profound than comfortable narratives permit. The texts remain, waiting, the questions remain, unanswered, and the choice remains, always, hours to make.